Choice Hotels get you more of what you value. Comfort Inn, it's calling your name. Save on the stay. Oh, and free waffles are yours to claim. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
Origins of the Templars and the new knighthood. Christianity was founded on a pacifist ideal, and strong voices within the church continued to be raised against the use of violence in any circumstances. But instead of chasing the impossible ideal of the total abolition of violence, the papacy had spent much of the 11th century trying to control and channel violence, for example, trying to limit feudal warfare by promoting a set of rules called the Truce of God. Part of Pope Urban's thinking in launching the First Crusade was to usefully externalize this aggression by redirecting it against the Muslim threat. The use of force against a deadly enemy and in the service of Christ had already been justified in the 5th century by no less a figure than St. Augustine of Hippo, who in The City of God described the necessity of repelling the pagan barbarian invasion of Italy. Similarly, Christians saw the First Crusade as an entirely just war. But however much the First Crusade may have brought about a widespread acceptance of warfare in the name of God, what was new and exceptional was that the need to provide security for pilgrims to Jerusalem gave rise to a body of armed knights who were also monks. On 17th of July, 1099, 2 days after the reconquest of Jerusalem, the Crusader barons met to choose a leader. This was against the wishes of the Tafurs, who hourly awaited the Second Coming and wanted no government at all. The favorite choice among the barons would have been Adhemar, Bishop of Le Puy, but he had died of illness a year earlier at Antioch. In his stead, the crown was offered to Raymond of Toulouse. His age, wealth, experience, and his closeness to both Adhemar and the Byzantine Emperor Alexius made him the almost necessary choice. But Raymond knew he was unpopular, and his own soldiers wanted to return home, so reluctantly he refused. Of the other candidates, Bohemond had already made himself Prince of Antioch after leading the attack on that city. Tancred was regarded as merely an appendage of his uncle, and Robert of Normandy had let it be known that he wanted to return to Europe. And so, on 22nd July, the crown was offered to Godfrey of Bouillon, who delicately replied that he would wear no crown where Jesus had worn the crown of thorns, nor would he presume to bear the title of king in Christ's holy city, but he would accept kingly powers under the title of Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. There were some, and perhaps Godfrey was among them, who wanted Jerusalem to be governed as a theocracy under a patriarch appointed by the Pope in Rome. But within a year, Godfrey was dead, and the crown passed to his brother, who had no qualms about ruling over a secular kingdom of Jerusalem as Baldwin I. For his palace, he used the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was assumed to stand on the site of Solomon's Temple, while the Dome of the Rock, which does occupy that site, became a Christian church, the Templum Domini, the Temple of the Lord, surmounted by a cross, and served also as the residence of the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. The Crusader states, or Outremer as they were collectively called, French for overseas, formed a series of contiguous territories that were linked to Europe by Byzantine Asia Minor and reached as far south as Egypt and the Red Sea. The Kingdom of Jerusalem closely corresponded in extent to the Kingdom of David and Solomon. That is all of what is today the state of Israel, plus the east bank of the Jordan River, western Jordan, southern Lebanon, and southwestern Syria, including the Golan Heights. Dependent on Jerusalem were the feudal Crusader states of Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli. Bohemond had established the Principality of Antioch in 1098 as the Crusaders were still advancing towards Jerusalem, while Baldwin of Boulogne, the future Baldwin I of Jerusalem, had carved out the inland county of Edessa in that same year. Raymond of Toulouse began the conquest of northern Lebanon and coastal Syria in 1102, which when completed under his successors in 1109 would form the county of Tripoli. The soldiers and rulers of Outremer were European, largely French in origin, and the commercial class was mainly Italian. During the first decades, many of these Franks, as the Westerners were known, conquerors, traders, settlers, and pilgrims, mingled with the indigenous inhabitants, adopted their dress and customs, were tolerant towards Muslims, and intermarried with local Christians. Fulcher of Chartres, a chronicler of the First Crusade, who died in Jerusalem in 1127, was a first-hand observer. Now we who were Westerners have become Easterners. He who was Italian or French has in this land become a Galilean or a Palestinian. He who was a citizen of Reims or Chartres is now a Tyrian or an Antiochene. We have already forgotten our birthplaces. Most of us do not know them or even hear of them. One already owns home and household as if by paternal and hereditary right. Another has taken as wife not a compatriot but a Syrian, Armenian, or even a baptized Saracen woman. He who was an alien has become a native. He who was an immigrant is now a resident. Divisions in the Islamic world, not only the rivalry between the Fatimids in Egypt and the Baghdad Caliphate, which had been taken over by the Seljuk Turks, but divisions among the Seljuks themselves meant that the Middle East was fragmented into numerous Muslim emirates. The Crusader states fitted into this mosaic and, from the Muslim point of view, were no more disturbing than any other emirates. The Franks fought against Muslims, but also made alliances with them. The fighting, which was on a minor scale, was no more than had been taking place in recent centuries among Muslims themselves. The fact that Christians were involved was of no great significance in a region where a large number of Christians had been a factor all along. If anything, Outremer was a source of fruitful interchange of goods and ideas between Latin Europe and the Muslim East. With the help of the Crusaders, the Emperor Alexius Comnenus had recovered Asia Minor for the Byzantine Empire, and in exchange for subsidizing the Westerners, he assumed that he would get back Syria too. But Antioch, which had been taken from the Byzantines by the Seljuks as recently as 1085, was claimed by Bohemond instead. Bohemond was a Norman, and the Normans had long had designs on Constantinople, wanting to add it to their string of conquests in England, southern Italy, and Sicily. Nor were the rest of the Crusaders interested in sharing their conquests in Syria and Palestine. Behind this was the long-developing rift religious, political, and economic between Western Europe and the East Roman Empire. This deeply aggrieved Alexius and prevented the formation of a united Christian front against the Muslims, such as existed in the West, against the Arab occupation of Spain. As previously noted, the Crusaders had arrived in the Middle East at a time when there were deep divisions among the Muslims, not only between Sunni and Shia, but also as the Arabs were being subjected to domination by the newly arrived Turks, who themselves were increasingly at odds with one another. But should that situation ever change, the Crusader states would find themselves alone, dependent on their command of the sea, their supply lines to the west, and what defenses they could put in place against a unified Muslim power. Many of those who came on the First Crusade went home when it was over, and few of the pilgrims who followed in their wake chose to settle in the Holy Land. Owing to insufficient Frankish immigration, the Crusader states would always be short of fighting men. The king of Jerusalem, the prince of Antioch, and the counts of Edessa and Tripoli could between them raise no more than 2,000 knights. The towns were made secure, but travelers along the roads were vulnerable to brigands and sudden enemy raids. Ceolwulf of Canterbury, who visited the Holy Land in 1102, described how parties of pilgrims landing at Jaffa were exposed to attack as they journeyed along the mountain road to Jerusalem. Pilgrims who wearied and fell behind, or groups that were vulnerably small, were prey to bands of nomadic Bedouin who lived in the surrounding wilderness. The bandits did not hesitate to kill to get at the money sewn into travelers' clothes. Corpses were left to rot along the route up to Jerusalem because it was too dangerous for their companions to leave their party to give them a proper Christian burial. There was danger not only from brigands, but from Turkish forces in the north and Egyptians in the south. A Russian recounting his pilgrimage in 1106-07 was referring to the Fatimid Egyptians who held Ascalon, south of Jaffa, when he wrote of his visit to the Church of St. George at Lydda on the Jaffa, Jerusalem Road. There are many springs here. Travelers rest by the water, but with great fear, for it is a deserted place, and nearby is the town of Ascalon, from which Saracens sally forth and kill travelers on these roads. The Russian's journey to Galilee, which took him near the town of Baisan, was no less hazardous. 7 rivers flow from this town, and great reeds grow along these rivers, and many tall palm trees stand about the town like a dense forest. This place is terrible and difficult of access, for here live fierce pagan Saracens who attack travelers at the fords on these rivers. An especially shocking attack took place at Easter 1019, when a large party of 700 unarmed pilgrims, both men and women, set out from Jerusalem for the river Jordan. They were traveling, in the words of a German chronicler, in joy and with a cheerful heart, when they were set upon by an Egyptian sortie from Ascalon. 300 pilgrims were killed, and another 60 were captured to be sold as slaves. The formation of the Templars arose out of these conditions of insecurity on the roads and the murder, rape, enslavement, and robbery of unarmed pilgrims. Only recently, a group of 9 French knights, most prominently Hugh of Paynes, a knight from Champagne who had fought in the First Crusade, and Godfrey of Saint-Omer in Picardy, had proposed to the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Warmond of Picquigny, and King Baldwin II, who had succeeded his cousin in 1118, that for the salvation of their souls they form a lay community, or perhaps even withdraw into the contemplative life of a monastery. Instead, Baldwin, alive to the urgent dangers confronting travelers in his kingdom, persuaded Hugh of Paynes and his companions to save their souls by protecting pilgrims on the roads, or as one chronicler put it, they were to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but were also to defend pilgrims against brigands and rapists. The Easter massacre along the road to the River Jordan persuasively drove home the king's view, and on Christmas Day 1119, Hugh and his companions took their vows before the Patriarch in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, calling themselves in Latin the pauperes commilitones Christi, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. The king and patriarch probably saw the creation of a permanent guard for travelers as complementary to the work of the hospitallers who were providing care for pilgrims arriving at Jerusalem. Already in 600, Pope Gregory the Great had commissioned the building of a hospital at Jerusalem to treat and care for pilgrims, and 200 years later Charlemagne, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, enlarged it to include a hostel and a library. But in 1005 it was destroyed as part of the Fatimid Caliph Hakim's violent anti-Christian persecutions. In 1170, merchants from Amalfi obtained permission from the Fatimids to rebuild the hospital, which was run by Benedictine monks and dedicated to St. John the Almsgiver, a charitable 7th-century patriarch of Alexandria. But after the First Crusade, the hospital was released from Benedictine control and raised an order of its own, the Hospitallers of St. John, which was recognized by the Pope in 1113 and came under his sole jurisdiction. Official acceptance of the new order came at Nablus in January 1120, when the 9 members of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ were formally introduced to an assembly of lay and spiritual leaders from throughout the lands of Outremer. In this year, too, they first attracted the attention of a powerful visitor to Outremer, Fulk V, Count of Anjou, who on his return home granted them an annual revenue, an example that was soon followed by other French nobles, which added to the allowance they were already receiving from the canons of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Yet altogether, these amounted to only a modest income, and individually the poor fellow soldiers were genuinely poor, and dressed only in donated clothes, meaning they had no distinctive uniform. The white tunic emblazoned with a red cross came later. Their seal alludes to this brotherhood in poverty by depicting two knights, perhaps Hugh of Paynes and Godfrey of Saint-Omer, having to share a single horse. They were also given the use of another hand-me-down. After the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, the king had made do with the Al-Aqsa Mosque for his palace, but now he had built a new palace to the west, and he gave what had been the mosque to the poor fellow soldiers. They made it their headquarters, residing there and using it to store arms, clothing, and food, while stabling their horses in a great underground vault at the southeast corner of the Temple Mount. As the vaults were thought to have been Solomon's stables, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque was known as the Mosque of the Templum Solomonis, because it was believed to have been built on the site of Solomon's temple, it was not long before the knights had encompassed the association in their name. They became known as the Pauperes Commilitones, Christi Templice, Solomonici, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Or, in a word, the Templars. A story much put about these days in books like the Da Vinci Code and the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail is that the Templars were founded not to protect pilgrims or to defend the Holy Land, but to undertake secret excavations beneath the surface of the Temple Mount. This argument takes advantage of gaps and uncertainties in the historical record, and it turns unknowns into mysteries or into conspiracies. Why were there only 9 Templars? Because they had a secret to keep, and so the fewer the better. Why do we know so little about the military activities of the Templars in their early years? Because really they were digging holes in the Temple Mount. Why did the Templars become so powerful? Because they found a huge treasure or discovered an explosive secret beneath the Temple Mount, which they used to blackmail the church. Why were the Templars destroyed? There are indeed numerous holes, cisterns, chambers, and tunnels beneath the Temple Mount, some of them very ancient and going back even before the time of Solomon, others dating from the years when the Templars were in residence. Over the centuries, pilgrims and travelers have recorded their own explorations and discoveries, and in modern times, the Temple Mount has been studied by archaeologists. For more on which, see the locations section of this book. In the autumn of 1127, Baldwin II sent emissaries to the west in an effort to solve 2 fundamental problems facing the Kingdom of Jerusalem: its military weakness and his lack of a male heir. Baldwin had 4 daughters, but no sons, and to secure the succession, he and his barons had decided to offer the hand of Melisande, his oldest daughter, to Fulk V, Count of Anjou. In the event, the mission to Fulk was a complete success. The Count agreed to return to Outremer and marry Melisande, securing the succession and strengthening the kingdom's ties with the West. Baldwin also sent Hugh of Paynes, the Grand Master of the Templars, sailing westwards at the same time, his mission to solicit donations and to raise recruits. The king had prepared the ground for Hugh by writing to Bernard, the abbot of the Cistercian monastery of Clairvaux, explaining that the Templars were seeking approval of their order from the Pope, who they hoped would also initiate a subsidy that would help fund the battle against the enemies of the faith who were threatening the very existence of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin knew his man. Bernard had already written to the Pope objecting to a proposal put forward by a fellow abbot to lead a mission of Cistercians to the east, saying that what the Holy Land really needed was fighting knights, not singing and wailing monks. Bernard of Clairvaux, who was made a saint within 20 years of his death, was one of the most influential and charismatic figures of the medieval church. A volatile and passionate young man of an aristocratic family, he deliberately sought out the Cistercian order, known for its austerity, and in 1113 joined its monastery at Citeaux. 3 years later, at the age of 26, he founded a new Cistercian house and became its abbot, calling the monastery Clairvaux, meaning the Valley of Light. By the time Pope Honorius II was elected in 1124, Bernard was already regarded as one of the most outstanding churchmen of France. He attended important ecclesiastical assemblies, and his opinion was regularly sought by papal legates. Significantly, Clairvaux was built on land given to Bernard by Hugh, the Count of Champagne, whose vassal was Hugh of Paynes, the future founding Grand Master of the Templars. By the time Hugh of Paynes sailed westwards in 1127, Bernard was already well informed about the East and what was needed there. His mother's brother was André of Montbard, one of the original 9 Templars, and Bernard's early patron, the Count of Champagne, had 3 times gone on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and on the last occasion, in 1125, he too renounced his worldly possessions and joined the Templars. Grants of land as well as silver, horses, and armor were made to the Templars almost as soon as Hugh of Paynes landed in France in the autumn of 1127. The following summer, the Grand Master was in England, where he was received with great honor by King Henry I, who donated gold and silver to the order. Hugh established the first Templar house in London at the north end of Chancery Lane, and he was given several other sites around the country. More donations followed when Hugh traveled north to Scotland. In September, Hugh of Paynes had returned across the Channel, where he was met by Godfrey of Saint-Omer, and together they received further grants and treasures, all these given for the defense of the Holy Land and for the salvation of their donors' souls. The climax of Hugh of Paynes' tour came in January 1129 at Troyes, the capital of the Counts of Champagne, where Theobald, Hugh of Champagne's successor, hosted a convocation of church leaders dominated by the presence of Bernard of Clairvaux. Hugh addressed the assembly and described the founding of the Templars and presented their rule, adapted from the precepts followed by the canons of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This stipulated attendance at services together with the canons, communal meals, plain clothing, simple appearance, and no contact with women. Because their duties carried them away from the church, they could replace attendance with the recitation of paternosters, and they were also allowed a horse and a small number of servants. And while the order was under the jurisdiction of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, they owed their individual obedience to the Grand Master. These regulations formed the raw material from which, after considerable discussion and scrutiny by the gathered churchmen, Bernard drew up the Latin rule of 72 clauses. Bernard's Latin rule enjoined the Templars to renounce their wills, to hold worldly matters cheap, and not be afraid to fight, but always to be prepared for death and for the crown of salvation and eternal life. The knights were to dress in white, symbolizing that they had put the dark life behind them and had entered a state of perpetual chastity. The hair on their heads was to be cut short, but all Templar knights wore beards, as they were not permitted to shave. Foul language and displays of anger were forbidden, as were reminiscences about past sexual conquests. Property, casual discussion with outsiders, and letters and gifts given or received were subject to the approval of the master. Discipline was enforced by a system of penances, with expulsion the punishment in extreme cases. In all this, the Templars were regulated like monks, but when it came to guidance in military matters, Bernard offered few practical injunctions, though he did understand that in creating a new type of order in the holy places, one that combined knighthood with religion, the Templars needed to possess land, buildings, serfs, and tithes, and was entitled to legal protection against what the Latin rule called the innumerable persecutors of the Holy Church. For all their reputation as warriors, the Knights Templar were very much monks and lived the monastic life in accordance with the canonical hours as indicated by this outline of their day. 4 a.m. Rise for matins and attend to horses, then return to bed. 6 a.m. to noon. Attend services, prime, around 6 a.m., tierce, around 9 a.m., and sext, towards noon. Meanwhile, train and groom horses. Noon dinner of cooked meats. Complete silence throughout the meal while the chaplain reads from the Bible. 3 p.m. Attend nones, the afternoon service. 6 p.m. Attend vespers, followed by supper. 9 p.m. Attend compline, after which the knights receive a glass of wine and water. Then instructions for the following day. Attend to horses, midnight. To bed in complete silence until 4 a.m. The endorsement of the Templars by the Council of Troyes was subsequently confirmed by Pope Honorius II. These successes had come largely through the efforts of Bernard of Clairvaux, who was now urged by Hugh of Pain to write a robust defense of the Templars for general distribution. De Laude Novae Milite was the name of Bernard's panegyric in praise of the new knighthood, in which he announced the Templars as the champions of a higher struggle in which homicide, which was evil in Christian eyes, was really malicide, that is, the killing of evil itself, which was good. The Holy Land, wrote Bernard, bore the impress of Jesus' life, Bethlehem, Nazareth, the Jordan River, the Temple Mount, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which encompassed the places of Jesus' crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. The Templars were the protectors of these holy sites and even acted as pilgrim guides. But by their proximity and daily familiarity with these footsteps in the life of Jesus, the Templars also had the advantage and the duty to search for the deeper truth, the inner spiritual meaning of the holy places. The implication of Bernard's de Laude was that by understanding the full meaning of their role, the Templars would be fortified in their mission, which had gone beyond policing the pilgrimage routes and now embraced the defense of the Holy Land itself. Following the death of Hugh of Pains in 1136, his successor Robert of Craon, the second Grand Master, consolidated the gains made at Troy by securing for the Templars a string of papal bulls, from bullum, the Latin for seal, and so meaning an official decree. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued Omni Datum Optimum, which had the effect of establishing the Templars as an independent and permanent order within the Catholic Church, answerable to no one but the Pope, and sanctioned their role as defenders of the Church and attackers of the enemies of Christ. The Grand Master was to be chosen from among the ranks of the Templar Knights, free from outside interference. The Templars were also given their own priesthood answerable to the Grand Master even though he was not ordained, which made the order independent of the diocesan bishops in Outremer and the West, and they were allowed their own oratories and cemeteries. The Templars were exempted from all tithes, but they were free to collect tithes on their own properties. All spoils of battle against the infidel were theirs by right, and donations made to the Templars were put under the protection of the Holy See. These privileges were confirmed and extended by two further bulls, Milites Templi, issued by Pope Celestine II in 1144, and Militia Dei, issued by Pope Eugenius III in 1145, which, taken together with Omni Datum Optimum, put the Templars beyond reproach and formed the foundation for their future wealth and success. It was also under Eugenius III that the Templars were granted the right to wear their famous habit of a red cross over a white tunic, symbolizing their readiness to suffer martyrdom in the defense of the Holy Land. Yet, for all the powerful backing the Templars received from the West, it comes as a surprise that there is so little on record to show for their activities in Outremer for the first 3 decades after their founding in 1119. This is in contrast to their evident importance in the Iberian Peninsula. In Spain, King Alfonso of Aragon had reconquered large territories from the Muslims, and was attracted to the concept of military orders as a means to safeguard them. When he died childless in 1134, he willed his entire kingdom to the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in equal measures. But though the will was contested and adjusted, a settlement was reached with the Templars in 1143, which gave them 6 major castles in Aragon, a 1/10 of royal revenues, and a 1/5 of any lands in future conquered from the Muslims, turning the Templars into a major force in the Reconquista against the forces of Islam. The Templars were the first. The Hospitallers followed them into the Iberian Peninsula around 1150. Christian rulers of the Iberian Peninsula could call on greater numbers of local Christian troops than their counterparts in Outremer, where so much of the population had been converted to Islam or driven out by Muslims. And so, the Templars played a less significant role in battle than in the Middle East. Instead, the principal task of the Templars was to build castles along the frontiers to prevent Muslim incursions. The responsibility for defending Aragon and Catalonia rested largely on the Templars and the Hospitallers, but in the center of the peninsula, the kings of Castile and Leon relied on homegrown military orders established for the most part during the 3rd quarter of the 12th century. Nevertheless, the Templars exercised considerable influence on these Spanish orders, which had been founded in direct imitation of their own order. The kings of Castile and Leon also entrusted the Templars with the overlordship of great tracts of underpopulated territory that fell to the Reconquista. The Templars played a similar role in the west of the Iberian Peninsula, where in the struggle against the Muslims a new nation was emerging, the independent Kingdom of Portugal. The Templars' commitment to the cause of the crusade against Islam made them perfect allies. At no cost to existing Portuguese resources, they were given anticipatory grants, so that as the frontier was extended against the Muslims during the 1130s and 1140s, the Templars acquired a share in newly recovered lands and were given control of border castles. Yet, in Outremer, where the availability of local Christian troops was more limited than in Iberia, meaning that the military orders might have found a greater battle role, the Templars are reported in medieval sources to have been involved in only 3 military engagements between 1119 and the arrival of the Second Crusade in 1148. They were at a failed siege of Damascus in 1129. They took part in a campaign to defend an eastern outpost of the county of Tripoli, which met with defeat in 1137, and they were worsted in a skirmish at Hebron in 1139. The Templars did take over responsibility for guarding the passes into Antioch from Asia Minor through the Amanus Mountains, where they were put in charge of Bagras Castle in about 1136. Otherwise, the surviving record is silent on the early decades of the Templars in the East, though the mystery is probably explained by the loss and destruction of sources, than by a lack of Templar activity. Certainly a section of opinion in the West was convinced, according to the chronicler Richard of Poitou, a monk of Cluny writing in 1153, that the Franks would long since have lost Jerusalem had it not been for the Templars. Templar origins, historical agendas. The Knights Templar would in time become one of the wealthiest and most powerful financial and military organizations in the medieval world. Yet there are holes in the historical record about their origins, and there are contradictions, too. When were they founded? How many were there? What accounts for their meteoric rise? Part of the problem in finding the answers to these questions lies in the nature of the sources themselves. The earliest chronicler of Templar history was William, Archbishop of Tyre. Born into a French or Italian family at Jerusalem in about 1130, he studied Latin and probably Greek and Arabic there before continuing his education from about 1146 to 1165 in France and Italy. After returning to Outremer, he wrote, among other works, a 23-volume history of the Middle East from the conquest of Jerusalem by Umar. This Historia Rerum, in partibus transmarinus gestarum, or History of Deeds Done Beyond the Sea, was begun around 1175 and remained unfinished at the time of William of Tyre's death in about 1186. most of it concentrated on the First Crusade and subsequent political events within the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Events from which William was not entirely detached, for he was involved in the highest affairs of both the kingdom and the church. And as Archbishop and contender for the office of Patriarch of Jerusalem, he was naturally jealous of any diminution of ecclesiastical authority, and so resentful of the Templars' independence and their rise to wealth and power. Two other early chroniclers were Michael the Syrian, Jacobite Patriarch of Antioch, who died in 1199, and Walter Map, Archdeacon of Oxford, who died in about 1209. But Michael was weak on matters outside his own experience and times, while Walter preferred a good story to sound historical inquiry, and moreover his prejudice against the Templars was fundamental, for he objected to the entire concept of an order of fighting monks. Despite his own bias against the Templars, William of Tyre is considered the most reliable of the three. He diligently sifted through sources to glean the facts about events that occurred before his time, and he made a point of interviewing surviving first-hand witnesses. All the same, William of Tyre did not even begin writing his history until the mid-1170s, that is 55 years after the founding of the Templars, and there is no earlier source. The chroniclers of the First Crusade, men like Fulcher of Chartres, Baldric of Dol, Robert the Monk, and Guibert de Nogent, had all completed their works within a decade of the reconquest of Jerusalem in 1099, and long before the foundation of the Templars in 1119. Or was it 1118? According to William of Tyre, it was the latter, but he was notoriously poor on dates, even if careful in other things, and the balance of scholarly opinion has the Templars established in 1119. In whatever year it was, it does not seem to have occurred to anyone to write a first-hand account of the founding ceremony of the Templars in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on Christmas Day. At the time, it did not register as a significant event. We do not even know how many founding members there really were. William of Tyre says that there were 9, and names the two most prominent as Hugh of Paynes and Godfrey of Saint-Omer. Other sources also name Archambault of Saint-Aignan, Payen of Montdidier, André of Montbar, Geoffrey Bissot, a knight called Rosal, or possibly Roland, another called Gondemar, and 2 more whose names have not survived. Moreover, William of Tyre maintains that even as late as the Council of Troyes in 1129, there were still only 9 Knights Templar. But why would only 9 men command such attention from the Council and the Pope? And why would Bernard of Clairvaux devote so much effort to praising their worth and propagating their fame? Indeed, in this case, Michael the Syrian seems to be more reliable, for he says there were 30 founding Templar knights, and most likely there were very many more a decade later. Just as we owe it to William of Tyre that the Templars comprised only 9 members right up to 1129, so we also owe to him the claim that they were a poor and simple order throughout the early decades of their foundation. Certainly the Templars looked back on themselves in this idealistic way, so that in 1167, when they were very rich indeed, they adopted as their seal the 2 knights astride 1 horse, a self-image perhaps also derived from their ascetic Cistercian promoter in the West, Bernard of Clairvaux. Yet, however humble the lives of the individual knights, the order itself was never indigent, not even at the start when already it was receiving an income from the canons of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, as well as significant donations from powerful French barons. But to portray the Templars as poor and humble and few in numbers in their early years gave William of Tyre a handy stick with which to beat them in his critical history. By the 1170s, according to William of Tyre, the Templars are said to have immense possessions both here and overseas, so that there is now not a province in the Christian world which has not bestowed upon the aforesaid brothers a portion of its goods. It is said today that their wealth is equal to the treasures of kings. William contrasts this state of affairs with the Templars' earlier simplicity, suggesting they have somehow betrayed themselves. But it seems that his real complaint is that their support in the West made them independent of any power in Outremer, particularly that of the Church as represented by William, the Archbishop of Tyre and would-be Patriarch of Jerusalem. Although they maintained their establishment honorably for a long time and fulfilled their vocation with sufficient prudence, later, because of the neglect of humility, they withdrew from the Patriarch of Jerusalem, by whom their order was founded and from whom they received their first benefices, and to whom they denied the obedience which their predecessors rendered. They have also taken away tithes and first fruits from God's churches, have disturbed their possessions, and have made themselves exceedingly troublesome. This was the beginning of the criticism the Templars would receive from sources whose interests they crossed. Some would call them saviors of the East and defenders of all Christendom. Others would find them troublesome and accuse them of arrogance, greed, secrecy, and deceit. Their destruction lay in their beginning. When there was no more East to save, the Templars would be doomed. The Second Crusade. The Templars emerge from the margins of history. The Christian states of Outremer enjoyed nearly half a century of security after the First Crusade, thanks to the divisions among their Muslim neighbors, the Fatimids in Egypt and the numerous Turkish-controlled statelets in Syria and Iraq, who often fought against one another. Occasionally, there were clashes between the Franks and Muslims, but these were minor affairs and did not threaten the existence of Outremer. Indeed, Muslim princes made alliances with the Christians against their common enemies. The most important of these enemies was Zengi, a Seljuk Turk, who began his career in 1127 when, on behalf of the moribund Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, he made himself Atabeg, or governor, of Mosul, in northern Iraq. By means of war and intimidation, Zengi soon extended his authority over much of Muslim Syria, and he would have taken Damascus too, but for an alliance between its Turkish ruler and King Fulk of Jerusalem. In the event, Zengi's greatest victory was his conquest of the county of Edessa in 1144. The first state founded by the Crusaders, Edessa was the first to fall, and Arab chroniclers later looked back on this triumph as the start of the jihad that would drive the Franks from the east. In the west, the loss of Edessa touched off the Second Crusade, a huge campaign by sea and land, this time led by two European kings. But the crusade may never have reached the Holy Land at all had it not been for the Templars, and when unexpectedly it failed, they became convenient scapegoats. Yet against the gathering forces of the Muslim jihad, Outremer could not have survived as it did for another 150 years without the religious conviction and military prowess of the brotherhoods of Christian warriors. In 1138, the Arab diplomat and chronicler Usama ibn Munkid was sent by the Turkish governor of Damascus, Mu'in al-Din Unur, to Jerusalem to discuss with King Fulk the possibility of an alliance against Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul. The Christian chronicler William of Tyre called Zengi a vicious man, and the Muslim inhabitants of Damascus agreed. They had learnt something of his brutality during his unsuccessful siege of their city in 1135, and the mission to Jerusalem was sent with popular support. For 2 years, Usama traveled back and forth, negotiating an alliance and making friends. Zengi threatened Damascus again in 1140, but his fear of being caught in a pincer movement forced him to withdraw, an event celebrated later that year when Usama accompanied Mu'in al-Din Unur on a state visit to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. During the times he spent in Jerusalem, Usama became a close observer of the Franks and their ways, and wrote about them in his chronicle. He regarded the Franks as the enemies of God, and attached to almost every account of them some imprecation like, "May Allah's curse be upon them." But that was more a doctrinaire reaction to their faith than a true expression of his attitude towards them as a people. Of one knight in the army of King Fulk, whom Usama got to know well, he wrote, "He was of my intimate fellowship and kept such constant company with me that he began to call me my brother. Between us were mutual bonds of amity and friendship. He admired Western medicine, and he was struck by the lack of restriction placed on their women by Frankish men. The Franks are void of all zeal and jealousy. One of them may be walking along with his wife. He meets another man who takes his wife by the hand and steps aside to converse with her while the husband is standing on one side, waiting for his wife to conclude the conversation. If she lingers too long for him, he leaves her alone with the conversant and goes away." Usama came to know the Templars particularly well and tells how they made a point of providing him with a place to pray. "When I was visiting Jerusalem, I used to go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque where my Templar friends were staying. Along one side of the building was a small oratory in which the Franks had set up a church. The Templars placed this spot at my disposal that I might say my prayers." Of course, Usama arranged himself to pray towards Mecca, which is south of Jerusalem, whereas Christian churches, wherever they may be, are oriented to the east. A Frank noticed Usama's direction of prayer and roughly pointed him towards the east, saying, "Thus do we pray." Usama's Templar friends rushed forward and led the man away, but when their attention was diverted, the man accosted Usama again, repeating, "Thus do we pray." Again the Templars intervened and led the Frank away, apologizing to their Muslim friend, saying the man had just arrived from the west and had never seen anyone pray as Usama had done. Usama concluded that everyone who is a fresh emigrant from the Frankish lands is ruder in character than those who have become acclimatized and have held long association with the Muslims. The fall of Edessa. Unfortunately for the Franks, they were often engaged in petty quarrels among themselves, and when Zengi's large and powerful army turned its unwelcome attention upon Edessa in 1144, Outremer was divided. The Count of Edessa, Jocelyn II, was at odds with the Prince of Antioch. The Count of Tripoli was only vaguely interested in events so far to the east. And in Jerusalem, King Fulk had just died, leaving the government in the hands of Queen Melisende as regent for Baldwin III, their 13-year-old son. Consequently, Zengi found his attack opposed only by the negligible forces of Edessa itself. The other Crusader states fringed the Mediterranean, but Edessa was landlocked. It lay beyond the Euphrates, a day's ride east of the river. Its population was made up of Christians of the East, Chaldeans, and Armenians, who were more devoted to trade than skilled in the use of arms. Westerners rarely visited the city, and those Franks who lived there had mostly married the local Christians, so that its defense was entrusted largely to mercenaries. When Zengi laid siege to the city, he came up against its formidable walls, but in the words of William of Tyre, "All these defenses could be of use against the enemy only if there were men willing to fight for their freedom, men who would resist the foe valiantly." The defenses would be useless, however, if there were none among the besieged who were willing to serve as defenders. Towers, walls, and earthworks are of little value to a city unless there are defenders to man them. Zengi found the town bereft of defenders and was much encouraged. Help was sent too late from Jerusalem and Tripoli, while Antioch sent no help at all. On Christmas Eve, 1144, Zengi's forces breached the walls and rushed into the streets and houses of the city. They slew with their swords the citizens whom they encountered, sparing neither age, condition, nor sex, wrote William of Tyre, and they enslaved any who survived. At first, the West was slow to react to the fall of Edessa. In autumn 1145, Pope Eugenius III wrote to King Louis VII of France, asking him to undertake a new crusade to the east. At Christmas, Louis summoned his barons and told them that he was taking the cross and invited them to do the same, but their response was poor. Louis was young, only 25. He was seen as impetuous, weak, and greedy, and he had angered his barons by recently seizing land from the Count of Champagne. But the barons did agree to convene again at Easter 1146 at Vézelay in Burgundy. Meanwhile, Louis arranged that Bernard of Clairvaux should speak at Vézelay. Not only was Bernard the friend of popes and kings, Eugenius had been a monk at Clairvaux, and the king's brother had recently joined the Cistercians there. But his asceticism, conviction, and eloquence combined to make him the most formidable spiritual figure of the age. At word that Bernard would speak, such a crowd of aristocrats and admirers from all over France were drawn to Vézelay, that as at Clermont, when Pope Urban called for the First Crusade, the cathedral was not big enough to contain the throng, and a platform was erected in the fields outside the town. This was an age like no other, Bernard told the crowd. God had found new ways to save the faithful. The fall of Edessa was a gift from God. It was an opportunity created by God to save men's souls. Look at the skill he is using to save you. Consider the depth of his love and be astonished, sinners. This is a plan not made by man, but proceeding from the heart of divine love. Amid the roars of Deus Levolt, so many came forward to take the cross that Bernard had to tear his own habit into strips. King Louis was the first among them, followed by his barons, many of whom were the sons and grandsons of original crusaders. Bernard was able to write a few days later to the Pope, "You ordered, I obeyed, I opened my mouth, I spoke, and at once the crusaders have multiplied to infinity. Villages and towns are now deserted. You will scarcely find one man for every 7 women. Everywhere you see widows whose husbands are still alive." Bernard broadcast his message farther, traveling into the north of France and to Flanders, and addressing a letter to the people of England, explaining that Jesus, the Son of God, was losing the land in which he had walked among men for more than 30 years. "Your land," Bernard told the English, "is well known to be rich in young and vigorous men. The world is full of their praises, and the renown of their courage is on the lips of all. Do not miss this opportunity. Take the sign of the cross. At once you will have indulgence for all the sins which you confess with a contrite heart. It does not cost you much to buy, and if you wear it with humility, you will find that it is the kingdom of heaven." News of the crusade had also reached Germany, where it touched off anti-Semitic pogroms along the Rhine. Bernard hastened to Germany to condemn the atrocities on the spot. "The Jews," he said, "are not to be persecuted, killed, or even put to flight. The Jews are for us the living words of Scripture, for they remind us always what the Lord suffered." And then, to control and give direction to the popular feeling, Bernard preached the crusade to the reluctant King Conrad III of Germany himself, finally persuading him to take the cross at Christmas 1146. The following spring, Pope Eugenius gave his blessing to the campaign of Alfonso VII of Castile against the Muslim occupation of Spain, declaring it a crusade, and that autumn a crusader fleet from northern Europe helped the Portuguese capture Lisbon from the Arabs. Largely through the energy of Bernard, the Second Crusade had rapidly become an international campaign against the forces of Islam on both the eastern and western fronts. Mary Magdalene at Vézelay. Vézelay was a particularly potent spot from which to launch the Second Crusade, for it possessed the bones of Mary Magdalene. The claim was first made by the great abbey church at Vézelay in the 1050s, an assertion quickly supported by a papal document dated 27 April 1058. The Muslim occupiers in the Middle East had recently been making it difficult for Europeans to undertake pilgrimages to the Holy Land, and this encouraged the development of pilgrimage sites within Europe itself. Various well-known New Testament figures were suddenly discovered to have traveled to the West and died there, their bones unearthed by enterprising churches. Glastonbury had already laid claim to Joseph of Arimathea in this way. In Paris, they announced the discovery of the bones of Saint Denis, a convert and student of Saint Paul, while Saint James had turned up in Spain at Compostela to aid the reconquest, and Saint Mark had arrived at Venice. Unfortunately, the great 9th century Romanesque church at Vézelay had been dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and as she had bodily risen to heaven at her Assumption, there was no question of finding her relics. But Vézelay lay along the profitable pilgrimage route from Germany to Compostela, and the profits to be gleaned from the passing trade, not to mention the prestige and the protection to be had, made the happy discovery of some suitable remains all but unavoidable, and who better than Mary Magdalene? In the Gospels, Mary Magdalene is present at the most important moments of the Jesus story, his death and his resurrection. At the crucifixion of Jesus, his disciples have gone into fearful hiding, but Mary Magdalene is at both the cross and the tomb, and it is she who carries the news to the disbelieving disciples that Jesus has arisen. Her appearances in the Gospels are brief, but telling. It is as if she fulfills the role of those ancient goddesses whose lives embraced the deaths and rebirths of their men. The shrine of Mary Magdalene at Vézelay became immensely popular. But how, the faithful wondered, had her bones come to Burgundy? A pious fiction was circulated saying that her relics had first been in Provence but were threatened by Saracen raiders, and so they were removed and brought to Vézelay for safekeeping. But how had the bones come to Provence in the first place? Another legend was invented to conveniently explain that Mary Magdalene and her companions had escaped from the Holy Land by sea and landed, some say, at Marseille, or according to others, at Les Saintes-Maries de la Mer, from where she made her way inland and died at Saint-Maximin-la-Stebaume. It was from there that a monk from Vézelay had dug up her bones and taken them back to Burgundy. Meanwhile, Mary Magdalene's bones were performing miracles. She was associated with the liberation of prisoners, assistance with fertility and childbirth, spectacular cures, and even the raising of the dead. Such wonderful stories demanded yet wider circulation, a challenge taken up in the 13th century by the Dominican writer Jacobus de Voragine. To his account of Mary Magdalene in his Compendium of Saints' Lives, called the Legenda Aurea, the Golden Legend, he added the plethora of new miracles put about by Vézelay and produced what very quickly became a medieval bestseller that was soon translated from Latin into nearly every European language, including Dutch and Czech. However, King Charles of Anjou, 1226-85, was establishing a Mediterranean empire based on Naples, Sicily, and his newly acquired territory of Provence. Learning from the Legenda Aurea that Mary Magdalene's bones had been associated with Saint-Maximin-la-Stebaume, he went to have a look for himself. And what did he find? The bones of Mary Magdalene. Clearly, the church at Vézelay had been mistaken. Charles installed the Dominican order as caretakers of Mary's shrine, and they in turn proudly broadcast the importance of their mission by fabricating the Book of Miracles of St. Mary Magdalene, documenting all the miraculous intercessions and cures the saint had wrought at her Provençal sanctuary. The publication's success was measured by the fact that Vézelay, as a center for the miraculous, soon went into decline. Indeed, pilgrims still come to Les Saintes-Maries de la Mer to see where Mary Magdalene came ashore and visit Saint-Maximin-la-Stebaume to kneel before her bones. The Templars' role in the Crusade. The growing importance of the Templars can be measured by the fact that on 27 April 1147, King Louis VII and Pope Eugenius III came to the Paris Temple, which had become the European headquarters of the order, to discuss plans for the Second Crusade. Also in attendance were 4 archbishops and 130 Templar knights, with at least as many sergeants and squires. Here it was agreed that the Templars would accompany the French army to the east, and it was probably on this occasion that the Pope conferred on the Templars the right to emblazon their white robes with the red cross, symbolizing their willingness to die in defense of the Holy Land. The Pope also appointed the Templar treasurer to receive the tax that had been imposed on all church goods to finance the crusade. It was the start of a fateful relationship that would last for over a century and a half, with the Paris Temple serving in effect as the treasury of France. Everard de Bars, the master of the temple in France, was sent ahead to Constantinople by the king to negotiate with the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Comnenus for the passage of the French and German armies. This time they had not been invited, and in Constantinople the prospect of their approach was regarded with some skepticism and alarm. Moreover, the Byzantines were at war with Roger II, the Norman king of Sicily, and to cover their backs had recently agreed a treaty with the Seljuks. To the minds of those in the West, this accommodation with the infidels seemed treacherous, an attitude that deepened suspicions on both sides. Nevertheless, everything seemed set fair in September 1147 when Conrad's army arrived in Constantinople and was ferried across the Bosphorus, to be followed by Louis's army a month later. The Second Crusade had 2 armies marching through Byzantine territory, and a large northern European fleet was heading into the Mediterranean after capturing Lisbon from the Muslims. The first disaster struck in late October. Conrad led his army on the direct route across Asia Minor and straight up against the border of Seljuk territory, where at Dorylaeum on 25 October the Germans were heavily defeated by the Turks. The survivors, including Conrad himself, retreated to Nicaea, where they joined the French, who were following the safer coastal route. At Ephesus, Conrad fell ill and returned with his forces to Constantinople, while the French, inadequately provisioned by the Byzantines, marched up the Meander Valley and eastwards against the advancing winter, toiling through the narrow defiles of the Cadmus Mountains in early January 1148. The heavily armored French knights were easy prey for the Seljuks' light cavalry with their talent for firing off arrows at full gallop. With his army on the verge of disintegration, King Louis surrendered his responsibilities to Everard de Bars, the Templar master, who divided the force into units, each under the command of a Templar knight whom they swore to obey absolutely. Thanks to the boldness and organizational skills of the Templars, the army was led to safety at Attalia, modern Antalya, on the Mediterranean. But their ordeal was not yet over, for the expected Byzantine fleet was too small to take them all to the Holy Land, so only Louis and part of his army sailed east. The rest attempted to march overland through Seljuk lands, and most of them died on the way. By the time Louis arrived at Antioch early in March, the cost of supplies and shipping had been so great that he needed to borrow if he was to continue with the crusade. Abandoning his intention of retaking Edessa, Louis instead led his army southwards via Tripoli to Jerusalem, where he fulfilled his pilgrim's vow, meanwhile dispatching Everard de Bars to Acre, where he raised enough money from Templar resources to cover the cost of the French expedition, a sum that was more than half the annual tax revenue of the French state. Despite the French losses in Asia Minor, the crusading forces that finally arrived in the Holy Land were far from negligible, and added to these were the survivors of the German army which had arrived by sea from Constantinople with Conrad. On 24th June 1148, the lords and military leaders then in Outremer attended a great council at Acre. Baldwin III, the 17-year-old king of Jerusalem, presided over the gathering, which included the Hospitallers and the Templars and the kings of Germany and France. Zengi was dead, but his son Nur al-Din controlled Aleppo in northern Syria astride the route to Edessa, and Raymond of Antioch wanted to strike in that direction. Others spoke of Egypt, but the road south was blocked by Ascalon, a powerfully fortified city still in the hands of the Fatimids. The third possibility was Damascus, the one Muslim power in the region willing to ally with the Franks against Nur al-Din, a fact that might have deterred some in Outremer, but meant nothing to the new arrivals from the west. In any case, for the Frankish states of Outremer perilously clinging to the Mediterranean seaboard, it was always a strategic necessity to extend their depth, to conquer Aleppo, Damascus, or Cairo. Damascus was a venerable and wealthy city whose capture would give the Franks control over the crossroads of commerce and communications in the east. After vigorous discussion of these various plans of action, the assembly finally decided to concentrate all the available forces of the crusade against Damascus. The Second Crusade marched out from Galilee for Damascus in late July 1148. The army camped in a well-supplied position amid orchards and fresh-flowing water in front of the western walls and prepared for the siege. But the orchards also served detachments of Damascenes, who used their cover to make repeated sorties against the Crusaders. Louis and Conrad responded by switching their attack to the eastern walls where there was open ground, and they could deploy their heavy cavalry to greater effect. But the city walls were higher on this waterless desert side, and when the siege dragged on, the Crusaders had no choice but to withdraw. Without even fighting a battle, the Second Crusade was defeated, ending in a whimpering fiasco. 6 years later, Damascus fell to Nur al-Din, and the encirclement of Outremer by a united Muslim power began. The strategic importance of Damascus. If the Second Crusade proved a calamity for its failure to capture Damascus, the great error had already been committed half a century before when Damascus was not seized by the First Crusade. Then the momentum was with the Franks, who had the men to do the job, but their ideological fixation on Jerusalem obscured the strategic reality. As it was, the Crusader states formed a long, thin line along the Mediterranean coast from the Amanus Mountains in the hinterland to the east, where Damascus sits on the desert fringe. Eastwards of this hinterland lay nothing but barren desert, not easily traversed by large armies. If the First Crusade had taken Damascus, it would have cut the Muslim world in two. Instead, this hinterland became a highway for Muslim forces moving between Baghdad, Aleppo, Damascus, and eventually Cairo, who freely harassed Outremer all along its desert flank and kept the Christian forces permanently stretched. The withdrawal from Damascus caused a bitterness in relations between Outremer and the West that lasted for a generation. Seen from the perspective of the East, Kings Louis and Conrad had neither recovered Edessa nor offset its loss by taking Damascus or anything else. Indeed, their bungling placed Outremer in greater peril than before the crusade began. In the West, the failure of the crusade came as a shock because it had been led by the powerful kings of Germany and France and had been preached by Bernard of Clairvaux, the greatest spiritual figure of the age. Some blamed the Franks of the East, who had previously been in alliance with the ruler of Damascus. Some German chroniclers, anxious to protect Conrad, blamed the Templars, saying that they had deliberately engineered the retreat. The anonymous Würzburg chronicler wrote of Templar greed and of betrayal by taking a massive bribe. The French did not make the same accusations, having been supported by the Templars throughout. And in fact, there is no evidence of Templar treachery, but it is significant that they were blamed. It was the first indication that the long history of ambiguous feelings about the foundation of an order of monks who also fought for God might be translated into open and specific complaints. The problem was that the more the Franks of Outremer relied on Western subsidy and military aid, the more critical the West became if things went wrong. The enthusiasm was there, but only for victories that came easily and cheap. From now on, The defense of the Holy Land would depend on its network of castles, largely built and commanded by the knights of the military orders. From the moment that the First Crusade arrived in the Middle East, the Crusaders started building castles. As in Europe, they served as residences and administrative centers, as well as having a military function. But after the Second Crusade, the Franks in Outremer found themselves on the defensive, and the military nature of castles became more important. Often large and elaborate, and continuously improved by the latest innovations in military science, the Franks built over 50 castles in Outremer. Geography, manpower, and the feudal system all explain this considerable investment in stone. The Crusader states were long and narrow, lacking defense in depth. The Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem stretched 450 miles from north to south, yet rarely were they more than 50 to 75 miles broad. The County of Tripoli perilously constricting to the width of the coastal plain, only a few miles broad, between Tortosa, present-day Tartus, and Gebli. The inland cities of Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus all remained in Muslim hands, while Mesopotamia and Egypt were recruiting grounds for any Muslim counterthrust, as the campaigns of Saladin and the Mamelukes would show. For the Crusaders, the natural defensive line was the mountains, and they built castles to secure the passes. Stones more than soldiers were pressed to this purpose, as Outremer was chronically short of men. After the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099, most of the Crusaders returned to Europe. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was thereafter defended by 300 mounted knights. Despite successive crusades, at no time during the entire history of the Crusader states were they able to put more than 2,600 horse in the field. Moreover, though there was still a large local Christian population, these were Orthodox, while the Crusaders were a Latin minority. Outnumbered and insecure, the Franks of necessity housed themselves in fortified towns or in castles. Nevertheless, if the Crusader states were to survive, they had to be a going concern, and the Franks set about organizing their possessions along familiar European feudal lines. Castles were as much centers of production and administration as they were military outposts, battlemented country houses, containing corn mills and olive presses, and surrounded by gardens, vineyards, orchards, and fields. Their lands in some cases encompassed hundreds of villages and a peasantry numbering tens of thousands. Wood to Egypt, herbs, spices, and sugar to Europe were important exports. Indeed, throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe's entire supply of sugar came from the Latin East. But in times of war, agriculture was always the first victim. Were it not for Western subvention and the taxes imposed on trade between the Muslim East and Europe as it passed through the Crusader states, they would have collapsed sooner than they did. The Latin rulers were always strapped for cash, the bulk of their revenues going towards the upkeep of mercenaries, knights, and castles. It was a vicious circle: insufficient land and manpower, making castles a necessity. The cost of knights and castles greater than the productivity of the land could justify. In this situation, the military orders came into their own. They had the resources, the independence, the dedication, the elements of their growing power. Structure of the Templars. The top 5 officials of the Knights Templar were the Grand Master, the Seneschal, the Marshal, the Commander of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the Draper. Ultimately, the order owed its allegiance to the Pope and to no other authority, spiritual or temporal. The Grand Master, ruler of the order, the Grand Master was elected by 12 senior Templar members, the number representing the 12 apostles, plus a chaplain who took the place of Jesus Christ. The Master had considerable but not autocratic powers. Grand Chapter. Comprised of senior officials, All major decisions by the Grand Master, such as whether to go to war, agree a truce, alienate lands, or acquire a castle, required that he consult with the chapter, seneschal deputy and advisor to the Grand Master. Marshal responsible for military decisions, such as purchase of equipment and horses. He also exercised authority over the regional commanders. Draper. The keeper of the robes, the draper issued clothes and bed linen, removed items from knights who were thought to have too much, and distributed gifts made to the order. Regional commanders. These were the commander of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, who acted as the order's treasurer and within the kingdom had the same powers as the Grand Master. The commander of Jerusalem, who within the city had the same powers as the Grand Master. And the commanders of Acre, Tripoli, and Antioch, each with the powers of the Grand Master within their domains. Provincial masters. France, England, Aragon, Poitou, Portugal, Apulia, and Hungary each had a provincial master who was responsible to the Grand Master. The knights, sergeants, and other men-at-arms were subject to these various officers and their deputies. After the Second Crusade, both the Hospitallers and the Templars came to provide the backbone of resistance to the Muslims, but the military impetus came from the Templars. The Hospitallers were still an entirely pacific order when the armed order of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ came into being. But sometime in the 1120s, the Hospitallers extended their role from caring for pilgrims to protecting them by force of arms if need be, becoming known as the Knights of the Hospital of St. John, or Knights Hospitaller, with St. John no longer the almsgiver but replaced by the more imposing figure of St. John the Baptist. The first recorded instance of Hospitallers in combat dates from 1128, 8 years or so after the founding of the Templars. It was the example of the Templars that helped turn the Hospitallers into a military order. In due course, the military orders were put in possession of the great castles, a task for which they were perfectly suited. The frontier castles were remote, isolated, and lonely places. They did not appeal to the secular knighthood of outre-mer. But the monastic vows of the military orders suited them to the dour life of castles where the innermost fortifications served as monasteries for the brothers. Their members were celibate, which made them easy to control, and they had no outside private interests. Superbly trained and highly disciplined, the Hospitallers and the Templars were led by commanders of considerable military ability. The capabilities of the orders generally stood in marked contrast to those of the lay institutions of outre-mer. The orders owed direct responsibility to the papacy, placing them above not only local feudal quarrels, but the antagonisms of nations and their kings. As corporate bodies, the orders were everlasting, their numbers undiminished by disease or death, and they were able to draw on an inexhaustible supply of young men of noble families in Europe seeking to fulfill the moral and religious obligations of knighthood. Also, the Templars and the Hospitallers received donations of property in Europe, which soon made them wealthy. Each order levied its own taxes, had its own diplomatic service, and possessed its own fleet of ships. In effect, the Hospitallers and the Templars were states within the state. Very quickly, the undermanned and underfinanced Crusader states were selling or giving frontier fortresses to the orders, and by 1166 there were only 3 castles in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which the military orders did not control. Costing the Templars. Every Templar was a highly trained and expensive mounted knight. Such a knight in the second half of 12th century France required 750 acres to equip and maintain himself as a mounted warrior, and a century later that cost had quintupled to 3,750 acres. For a Templar knight operating overseas in the Holy Land, the costs were even greater, as much had to be imported, not least horses. Each Templar knight had 3 horses, and because they fell victim to warfare and disease and had a lifespan of only 20 years, they needed to be renewed at a rate greater than local breeding allowed. The cost of horses rose sixfold from the 12th to the 13th centuries. Moreover, horses consumed 5 or 6 times as much as a man, and required feeding whether or not they were in use. A bad harvest in the east, and urgent food supplies had to be shipped in for men and horses alike. Each Templar also had a squire to help look after the horses. And, in addition, there were sergeants, more lightly armed than knights, who each had a horse but acted as their own squires. Sergeants were often locally recruited and wore a brown or black tunic instead of white. In fact, for every Templar knight there were about 9 others serving in support, whether as squires, sergeants, or other forms of help. This is not much different from modern warfare, in which every frontline soldier is backed up by 4 or 5 who never see combat, not to mention the many thousands of civilians producing weapons and equipment and providing clothing, food, and transport. Growing responsibilities increased Templar costs immensely. As secular lords found themselves unable to maintain and defend their castles and their fiefs, they handed these responsibilities over to the military orders. According to Benedict of Alignan, a Benedictine abbot visiting the Holy Land in the 1240s, the Templars spent 100,000 Saracen besants in 2.5 years on rebuilding their castle of Safed. This at a time when a knight in Acre could live well on 500 Saracen besants a year, and continued to spend 40,000 Saracen besants in each following year on the day-to-day running of the castle. Safed had a complement of 50 Templar knights, 30 mounted sergeants, as well as 50 mounted archers, 300 crossbowmen, 820 engineers and other serving men, plus 400 slaves, 1,650 people, which in wartime increased to 2,200, all of whom had to be housed, fed, armed, and kept supplied in various ways. Only their vast holdings in Outremer, and more especially in the west, permitted the Templars to operate on such a scale and recover after losses and setbacks to continue the defense of the Holy Land. When the First Crusade marched into the Middle East, it came over the Belen Pass, about 16 miles north of Antioch, that same crossing over the Amass Mountains that Alexander the Great had taken 1,400 years before, after crushing the Persian army of Darius III at the Battle of Issus. Known also as the Syrian Gates, the Belen Pass was the doorway into Syria, and it was also the northern frontier of Outremer. Sometime in the 1130s, the task of defending the pass was given to the Templars. Their key fortress was Bagras, built high above the pass itself, and the Templars built several others in the Amanus Mountains. These castles formed a screen across the northern frontier, where the Templars ruled as virtually autonomous border lords, effectively independent of the Principality of Antioch. The Templars also took charge of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's southern frontier with Egypt when they were made responsible for Gaza during the winter of 1149–50. Gaza was uninhabited and ruinous at this time, but the Templars rebuilt a fortress atop a low hill, and slowly the Franks revived the city around it. This was the first major castle in the Kingdom of Jerusalem that the Templars are recorded as receiving, and its purpose was to complete the blockade of Ascalon, 10 miles to the north, a small patch of territory on the Mediterranean coast still held by the Fatimids. Ascalon had long been the base for Muslim attacks on pilgrims coming up the road from Jaffa to Jerusalem or descending to the River Jordan, and in 1153 the city finally fell to Baldwin III, the king of Jerusalem. The Templars played a prominent part in this triumph, for they were first into the breach when a section of the walls came down. Yet William of Tyre was predictable in turning this against them when he claimed in his chronicle that their eagerness was due to their greed for spoils. In fact, the Templars lost 40 or so knights in the attack, and their Grand Master lost his life. Another vital strategic site as well as an important spot for pilgrims was Tortosa, present-day Tartus, on the Syrian coast, said to be the place where the Apostle Paul gave his first Mass. A chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary was built there in the 3rd century, long before Christianity was officially tolerated within the Roman Empire, and it contained an icon of the Virgin said to have been painted by St. Luke. To help the pilgrims who came to pray, the Crusaders built upon this history with the construction of Our Lady of Tortosa in 1123, an elegant cathedral which architecturally marks the transition from the Romanesque to the Gothic. But in 1152, Nur al-Din captured and burnt the city, leaving it deserted and destroyed. And as the county of Tripoli lacked the means for its restoration, Tortosa was placed in the care of the Templars, who greatly improved its defenses, building a massive keep and halls within a triple circuit of tower-studded walls, and with a postern in the seawall enabling the city to be supplied from sea. The strategic significance of Tortosa was that it stood at the seaward end of an opening in the range of coastal mountains which runs back into the interior towards the Muslim city of Homs. Towards the eastern end of this Homs Gap, as it is called, and towering high above the route between the interior and the sea, is the great castle of Crac des Chevaliers, gained by the Hospitallers in 1144, while in the mountains between Crac and Tortosa is the castle of Chastel Blanc, now known as Safita, already in the hands of the Templars some time before 1152. From the roof of the massive keep at Chastel Blanc can be seen both Crac des Chevaliers to the east and the Templar castle of Al-Arima to the west on the Mediterranean coast just south of Tortosa. In short, the Templars, together with the Hospitallers, entirely controlled the one important route between the interior of Syria and the sea. Moreover, they did so with sovereign rights within their territories, having been granted full lordship over the population of their estates, the right to share in the spoils of battle, and the freedom to have independent dealings with neighboring Muslim powers. In the 1160s, the Templars took over further castles, this time across the Jordan River at Ahamant, present-day Ammon, and in Galilee at Safed, also called Safad, to which was added Chastelet in 1178. Gaza, Ahamant, Safed, and Chastelet were all within the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but close to its borders where they served defensive purposes. Chastelet covered Jacob's Ford, the northernmost crossing point of the River Jordan, previously a weak point where Saladin came down out of Damascus and made easy raids against the Christians. So alarmed was Saladin when the Templars installed themselves at Chastelet that he immediately attacked, failing in his first attempt in June 1179, but 2 months later, storming the castle and taking 700 prisoners whom he then slaughtered, although the Templar commander threw himself to his death to avoid capture. More centrally placed was La Fève at the crossroads of the route between Jerusalem and Acre via Galilee. Acquired by the Templars in about 1170, it served as a major depot for arms, tools, and food, and it housed a large garrison. It was later the launching point for the expedition that led to the disastrous defeat at the Springs of Cresson on 1st May 1187, a foreboding of the catastrophe at Hattin. As well as fighting in the defense of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Templars continued to fulfill their original role of protecting pilgrims coming up to the holy sites at Jerusalem from the ports of Acre, Haifa, and Jaffa, or going down from Jerusalem to the Jordan River. One of the duties of the Templar commander in Jerusalem was to keep 10 knights in reserve to accompany pilgrims to the Jordan and to provide a string of pack animals to carry food and exhausted travelers. The Templars had a castle overlooking the site at the Jordan River where Jesus had been baptized to protect not only pilgrims but also the local monks after 6 of them were gratuitously murdered by Zengi. The acquisition of castles was accompanied by lands which helped to support them, especially around Bagras, Tortosa, and Safed. In these areas, the Templars held many villages, mills, and much agricultural land. The details are lacking because of the destruction of the Templar archives on Cyprus by the Ottoman Turks in the 16th century. But from what can be pieced together, it seems that the orders between them, the Hospitallers and the Templars, may have held nearly a fifth of the lands in Outremer by the middle of the century, and by 1188, the year of the Battle of Hattin, something like a third. merchant bankers, Europe's original financiers. The Templars became Europe's first bankers, a development unintended and unforeseen, yet one that arose naturally out of their situation. From their inception, the Templars were an international organization. Their purpose was in the Holy Land, but their support came from Europe, where they held land, collected tithes, and received donations from the pious. They organized markets and fairs, managed their estates, and traded in everything from wool and timber to olive oil and slaves. In time, they built up their own formidable Mediterranean merchant fleet, capable of transporting pilgrims, soldiers, and supplies between Spain, France, Italy, Greece, and Outremer. Disciplined, honest, and independent, the Templars were trusted throughout medieval society, and their experience in commerce and finance made them the ideal bankers to popes and kings. Yet in their success as bankers and financiers lay a chief cause of their fall. The Templars, like the Church and like the Crusades, were international in conception, but the 13th and 14th centuries were a time when national states were being constructed by European kings, especially by the kings of France. Just as the Templars raised money to defend the Holy Land with their arms, so they also provided money for the new nationalism arising in the West. But the nation-state of France would in turn nationalize the Templars and destroy them. Most of the Templars' imports, such as horses, iron, and wheat, came by sea. At first, the Templars contracted with commercial shippers and agents, but early in the 13th century, they began building up a fleet of their own. They had a substantial presence at all the important ports of Outremer, at Caesarea, Tyre, Sidon, Gibelais, ancient Byblos and present-day Jubail, Tripoli, Tortosa, Jeble, and Port Bonnel, north of Antioch. But their principal port was Acre, a walled city built on a tongue of land offering good protection for its double harbor. All the major powers of the Kingdom of Jerusalem were represented at Acre, but in 1191, after the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin, the city became the Templars' new headquarters in the Holy Land. According to the 13th century chronicler, known as the Templar of Tyre, the temple was the strongest place of the city, largely situated along the seashore, like a castle. At its entrance, it had a high and strong tower, the wall of which was 28 feet thick. He also mentions another tower built so close to the sea that the waves washed up against it, in which the temple kept its treasure. After 1218, the Templars supplemented their facilities at Acre with a new fortress of their own 30 miles to the south. Known today as Atlit, the Templars called it Chastel Pèlerin, because it was built on a rocky promontory with the help of pilgrims, pèlerin in French. This castle, said a German pilgrim who visited in the early 1280s, is sited in the heart of the sea, fortified with walls and ramparts, and barbicans so strong and castellated that the whole world should not be able to conquer it. From their ports in Outremer, the Templars' ships sailed to the west. Their major port of call in France was Marseille, from where they shipped pilgrims and merchants to the east. Italy's Adriatic ports were also important, especially Brindisi, which had the added advantage of being near Rome. Bari and Brindisi were sources of wheat and horses, armaments and cloth, olive oil and wine, as well as pilgrims. Messina in Sicily acted both as a channel for exports from the island and as an entrepot for shipping arriving from Catalonia and Provence. The Templars also built ships in European ports, everywhere between Spain and the Dalmatian coast. Another Templar cargo was white slaves. They were transported in considerable numbers from east to west, where they were put to work helping to run Templar houses, especially in southern Italy and Aragon. The Hospitallers also engaged in the trade and the use of slaves, indeed, the trade. In white slaves was a flourishing business for everyone, including the Italian maritime powers, especially Genoa, and most of all the Muslim states in the east. The center of the slave trade in the late 13th century was the Mediterranean port of Ayas in the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia. Marco Polo disembarked at Ayas in 1271 to begin his trip to China at about the same time that the Templars opened a wharf there. The slaves, who were Turkish, Greek, Russian, and Circassian, had been acquired as a result of intertribal warfare, or because impoverished parents decided to sell their children, or because they were kidnapped, and they were brought to Ayas by Turkish and Mongol slavers. The pick of young, strong males from the South Russian steppes or the Caucasus generally went to Egypt, where they were converted to Islam and served as elite slave soldiers known as Mamelukes. In 1250, the Mamelukes seized power in Egypt for themselves and led the final jihad that drove the Franks out of Outremer. In Outremer and the Iberian Peninsula, the Templars provided military services. But in England, France, and Italy, their primary contribution was financial. Individual monasteries had traditionally served as secure depositories for precious documents and objects. But during an age of greater movement, owing to the Crusades and the growth of trade and pilgrimages, the Templar network in the west of preceptories, that is, houses and estates, could offer a better service. The Templars developed a system of credit notes whereby money deposited in one Templar preceptory could be withdrawn at another upon production of the note, a procedure that required the meticulous and scrupulously honest record, keeping at which they excelled. Whether at Paris or Acre or elsewhere, the Templars kept daily records of transactions, giving details of the name of the depositor, the name of the cashier on duty, the date and nature of the transaction, the amount involved, and into whose account the credit was to be made. These daily records were then transferred to a larger register, part of a vast and permanent archive. These Templars also issued statements several times a year, giving details of credits and debits, and stating the origin and destination of each item. With their branch offices, so to speak, at both ends of the Mediterranean, and with major strongholds at the Paris and London temples, not only could they take deposits, but they could also make funds internationally available where and when they were needed. An obvious extension to guarding Crusaders' documents and money was to make funds available during the expeditions themselves. The Templars operated treasure ships offshore, from which campaigning knights and nobles and kings could make emergency withdrawals. The Templars also provided loans, for example, to Louis VII, the King of France, during the Second Crusade. This was the beginning of the Templars' close financial association with the French monarchy, effectively becoming its treasurers. From financing crusades, it was a small step for the Templars to become an integral part of the European financial system. King John of England borrowed from the Master of the Temple in London around the time of Magna Carta in 1215. After the Fourth Crusade, in which Latins overthrew the Byzantine emperors and put a Frenchman on the throne instead, the Latin Emperor Baldwin II borrowed an immense sum, which was secured against the True Cross. As part of their integral relationship with the European financial system, the Templars also became involved in the web that Italian merchants and bankers had spun across Europe and the Levant. In return for these services, the Templars received various privileges and concessions. By papal bull and the decrees of French and English kings, the Templars were given full jurisdiction over their estates and their inhabitants. They also obtained royal consent to organize weekly agricultural markets and annual fairs, which formed a focus for local trade and brought much income to the order, both from the dues paid by those taking part and through boosting the local economy generally. Combining agriculture with capital, the Templars were notably successful in the commercial exploitation of their estates, as in sheep farming in England, for example, which in combination with the Templars' ability to provide credit, turned them into major suppliers of wool. Not least among the benefits they obtained was the unimpeded export of goods and funds from the west to Outremer, Additionally, the Templars made profits on currency conversions and imposed charges on their services. Though not always openly stated in documents, they charged interest on loans, sometimes under the name of expenses to get round medieval scruples against interest, though sometimes they felt bold enough to declare that too. In 1274, for example, Edward III of England repaid the Templars the sum of 27,974 livres tournois, together with 33 livres, 6 sous, 8 deniers for administration, expenses, and interest, the total cost of the loan approaching 20%. The Paris Temple was the Templar headquarters in France. Built on land acquired by the Templars in the 1140s, nothing of it survives today, and it is remembered only by a street name in the Quartier du Temple, the northern part of the Marais district of the city. But from the 12th to the 14th century, it was one of the key financial centers of northwest Europe. The temple was located to the north of the city walls and was fortified with a perimeter wall and towers. Inside, there was an impressive array of buildings, and in the late 13th century, the Templars added a powerful keep, about 165 feet high, nearly twice as high as the White Tower, the keep at the center of the Tower of London. This Templar keep in Paris was the heart of the Templar Bank, and it was also effectively the treasury of the kings of France. During the French Revolution, it served as a prison for Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and it was from the keep that the king was led out to his execution. The London Temple, or the New Temple as it was called, would have been comparable to that of Paris, but only Temple Church, consecrated in 1185, remains today amid the Inns of Court off the south side of Fleet Street. The nave of Temple Church is round, as was typical with Templar churches, its plan following that of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. King John was actually resident at the New Temple at the time of Magna Carta in 1215 and was accompanied to his famous meeting with the barons at Runnymede by the master of the London Temple. But while the kings of England entrusted Templars with military, diplomatic, and financial commissions, they were always careful to keep the royal treasury as part of the royal household where it was run by royal officials, so that at most the new temple merely served to provide additional safe deposit space. The Templars' experience made them useful to the French monarchy and to the papacy, both of which wanted to maximize their revenues from taxation and reform the managing of their finances. For example, during the 33-year reign of Philip II, which extended from the late 12th century well into the 13th, the king's revenues were increased by 120%, thanks to Templar management. Yet Templar holdings were never entirely secure. Only the Paris Temple presented a truly formidable obstacle to a raid. Templar houses elsewhere in France were raided by the king. The London Temple was raided by kings of England in the 13th and 14th centuries when in desperate need, and in Spain the kings of Aragon did the same. But these were passing events in desperate times of need, and restitution was made. Ultimately, the Templars' best protection was not the stone walls of their treasure houses, but practical and moral constraints. The kings needed the Templars and their services too much to alienate them, nor could they afford to put themselves on the wrong side of a spiritual cause. At least not until Philip IV of France came up with a rationalization in October 1307. Bernard of Clairvaux described the Templars as men whose bodies were protected by iron and whose souls were clothed in the breastplate of faith. Religious orthodoxy was seen as no less a part of their equipment than their swords and armor. This was just as well, for Outremer at this time was a hothouse of heterodox and heretical beliefs, both Christian and Muslim, as was southern France, from where the order drew much of its support. The breastplate did its work. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars were seen as paragons of faith, and there was no suggestion that contamination had touched their souls. Moreover, within a century of their founding, the Templars had entered into the Western imagination as the ideal of chivalry and the guardians of the Holy Grail. all of which adds to the irony of the Templars' arrest in 1307 on charges of heresy and blasphemy. These charges and the Templars' prosecution and trial are covered later in the book. This chapter looks at the wider context. The Templars encounter with strange religious systems whose doctrines can be traced back to some of the earliest Christian beliefs in the East. At the root of these beliefs, which spread westwards into Europe during the Crusades, was the radical idea that man inhabits a world of delusion in which nothing is what it seems. During the 12th and 13th centuries, Languedoc in southern France was the center of a rich and complex religious life in which both Christian orthodoxy and heresy flourished. William of Puylaurens, the 13th century chronicler of the region, reported heretic communities of Arians, Waldensians, and Manichaeans. The Arians were the survival of that 900-year-old heresy that began in Alexandria and tended towards undermining the divinity of Jesus Christ, while the Waldensians were a new 12th century movement that espoused poverty, called for the distribution of property to the poor, rejected the authority of the clergy, and claimed that anyone could preach, saying their literal reading of the Bible was all that was needed for salvation. According to Peter of Les Vaux de Cernay, another 13th century chronicler, the Waldensians were evil men, but very much less perverted than other heretics. They agreed with us in many matters and differed in some. The other heretics were the Manichaeans, also known as Cathars, meaning pure. Languedoc was a major source of Templar income and recruits. The Templars partly owed their great expansion in the region to the support of the nobility with whom they were in close alliance, the combination of nobles, land, and Templar capital, allowing the establishment of new communities and the development of previously uncultivated territories. Some of these Templar patrons were renowned Cathar supporters. Catharism first appeared in southern France sometime in the years following the First Crusade. Its adherents quickly became numerous and well-organized, electing bishops, collecting funds, and distributing money to the poor. But they could not accept that if there was only one God, and if God was the Creator, and if God was good, that there should be suffering, illness, and death in His world. The Cathars' solution to this problem of evil in the world was to say there were really two creators and two worlds. The Cathars were dualists in that they believed in a good and an evil principle. The former, the creator of the invisible and spiritual universe, the latter, the creator of our material world. All matter was evil because it was the creation of the devil, but the ideal of renouncing the world was impractical for everyone, and so while most Cathars lived outwardly normal lives, pledging to renounce the evil world only on their deathbeds, a few lived the strict life of the perfecti. Because human and animal procreation perpetuated matter, the perfecti abstained from eggs, milk, meat, and women. But both ordinary Cathars and the perfecti actively shared in their belief that Christ was not part of this world of evil. Therefore, he was not truly born of the Virgin Mary, nor had he human flesh, nor had he risen from the dead. Salvation did not lie in his death and resurrection, which were merely a simulation. Instead, redemption would be gained by following Jesus' teachings. By 1200, the Cathar heresy had become so widespread that the papacy was alarmed. Pope Innocent III said that the Cathars were worse than the Saracens, for not only did Catharism challenge the Church, but by condemning procreation, it threatened the very survival of the human race. In 1209, a crusade was launched against them, the Albigensian Crusade, as so many Cathars lived around Albi and an inquisition was introduced. In that year, the core of Cathar resistance withdrew to the castle of Montségur atop a great domed hill in the eastern Pyrenees, where they withstood assaults and sieges until capitulating in 1244. Some 200 still refused to abjure their errors, were bound together within a stockade below the castle, and were set ablaze on a huge funeral pyre. The Templars played no part in the Albigensian Crusade. which was bound to attack some of their own patrons who were likewise patrons of the Cathars. The origins of Cathar dualism lay in the East, where it can be traced back to the Christian Gnostics, who flourished in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD all round the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean, in Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, and perhaps also in Asia Minor and Greece. Gnosis is Greek for knowledge, and the Gnostics believed that salvation lay in their understanding of the true nature of creation. They believed that there were two worlds: the material world of evil and decay that had been made by an evil demiurge, the enemy of man, and the world of light, where the primal God resides. One of the most prominent Gnostics was Valentinus, who flourished around AD 140 in Alexandria and Rome. He claimed to possess the true knowledge of how the world had been created and how evil had come into being, a story that he introduced to his followers in terms of a cosmic myth. He conceived of a primal God, the center of a divine harmony, who sends out manifestations of himself in pairs of male and female. Each pair was inferior to its predecessor, and Sophia, the female of the 30th pair, was the least perfect of all. She showed her imperfection not, like the angel Lucifer, by rebelling against God, but by desiring too ardently to be united to him, so that she fell through love, and the universe is formed out of her agony and remorse. As she fell, she bore a son, the demiurge, who rules this world of sadness and confusion, yet is incapable of realizing anything beyond it. Mankind inhabits a catastrophe not of God's making, but the Gnostics said they knew the secret of salvation. At the moment of the cosmic blunder, sparks of the divine light, like slivers of shattered glass, became embedded in a portion of humankind. These people were the elect, and the Gnostic aim was to lead them back to God. Cosmic redemption, however, and not just personal salvation, was necessary because the whole of creation had been a mistake. It had nothing to do with God, who had never intended that there should be a universe, indeed never intended man. Creation was a defective work, and so man lived in a meaningless world or in the iron control of evil powers. In any case, he was caught in the trap of the material world, which was sundered from the Spirit of God. Valentinus taught his followers that they could free themselves by attempting to quell their desires and by practicing sexual abstinence. For in the polarity of the male and the female was mirrored the division, the duality of the universe, so that the last judgment and the world's redemption would come, as Jesus says in the Gnostic Gospel of the Egyptians, when the two become one, and the male with the female, there being neither male nor female. Other Gnostics than Valentinus also had their stories, and some, instead of practicing abstinence, promoted sexual license, though the purpose was the same: to join the male and the female in order to achieve the desired oneness of the world. The crucifixion and resurrection has no place in these Gnostic stories. Instead, the role of Jesus was to descend from the primal God and impart to his disciples the secret tradition of the Gnosis. Islamic dualism. Dualism was deeply rooted in the East and did not confine itself to Christianity. In fact, the term Manichaean, the name some medieval French chroniclers gave to the Cathars, was used by the Byzantines to describe the dualist ideas of Mani, a 3rd century Persian who drew on Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Babylonian Mandaism, as well as Christianity. And so it was from several sources that dualism made its appearance in Islam. Though dualism is fundamentally incompatible with Islam, which teaches that God is the sole principle and is good. The political unity of the Muslim world had long been in decay, allowing for the manifestation of new religious tendencies. Just as the Middle East was divided into local dynasties and subject to pressures from the Abbasid Caliphate, the Seljuk Turks and the Fatimids of Egypt, not to mention the Byzantines, so it was divided into numerous sects. Among the Christians there were the Jacobites, Maronites, Copts, and Orthodox, and among the Muslims, the Sunnis, and numerous heterodox groups that had evolved out of Shi'ism. Among these, the Karmatian, Alawi, Druze, and Ismaili movements, which were not only movements of belief, but also initiatory secret societies with political aims tending towards the apocalyptic. The Ismailis continued certain pre-Muslim beliefs, in particular dualism, in which they saw evil not as the absence of good, but as part of the essence of both the world and its creator, who in turn may have been an emanation of an ultimate and unknowable God. Like the Gnostics, they believed that man possesses slivers of the divine spark which, given possession of the secret knowledge, can reunite man with the unknown God. The Ismailis claimed to possess this knowledge. But after Zengi's conquest of Edessa in 1144 and the surrender of Damascus to his son Nur al-Din, the Zengid dynasty imposed Sunni Islam on the entire Muslim population of Syria, driving the Shia sects into inaccessible regions. The Assassins. The Ismailis withdrew into that region of the coastal mountains, the Jebel al-Sariya, girded by the great Templar and Hospitaller strongholds of Tortosa, Chastelblanc, Margat, and Crac des Chevaliers, where the movement assumed its militant and murderous form known as the Assassins. From such strongholds as Al-Ulaika, Qadmus, Kalat al-Kaf, and especially Meshyaf, headquarters of the Assassins' leader, the Sheikh al-Jabal, the Old Man of the Mountain, they employed a strategy of assassination to influence and control anyone, mostly Sunni Muslims, but sometimes also Christians, who might threaten their independence. The assassins' particular glimpse of divine knowledge was described by Marco Polo, who encountered a branch at Alamut in Persia. The assassins used drugs, including hashish, from which the word assassin derives, to convince novices destined to become self-destructive feddayin, the self-sacrificers, that they had entered a garden of delights where fountains flowed with milk, honey, and wine, and where houris, those maidens of paradise, were likewise on tap. Brought back to their normal state, the initiates were told that they had indeed visited paradise, which would certainly be forever theirs, provided they gave absolute obedience to the commands of the assassin's imam. According to the reports of European chroniclers, the assassin leaders demonstrated their complete domination over their adepts by commanding them to leap from precipices to their deaths. Their willingness to sacrifice their lives made the Fedaeans' attacks that much more disturbing. Their mission was to sow fear of the sect and at the same time weaken the resolve of their enemies by the murder of key figures. The assassins infiltrated the ranks of their adversaries, and when they had won their victim's trust, they would kill him, always using a knife. These were suicide attacks, for apparently by design, they themselves perished in carrying out their orders. Among the assassins' Christian victims were Raymond II, Count of Tripoli, in 1152, Conrad of Montferrat, King of Jerusalem, in 1192, and another Raymond, heir to the thrones of Antioch and Tripoli, who in 1213 was stabbed to death outside the door of the Cathedral of Our Lady at Tortosa. But the assassin's most famous attempt was against Saladin in 1176. As the champion of Sunni orthodoxy and leader of the Muslim resurgence, Saladin had already overthrown the Shia Fatimids in Egypt and was now in full cry against the Crusaders and the assassins. He entered the Jebel al-Sariya to lay siege to Masyaf, but his soldiers reported mysterious powers about, while Saladin was disturbed by terrible dreams. One night he awoke suddenly to find on his bed some hot cakes of a type that only the assassins baked, and with them a poisoned dagger and a threatening verse. Convinced that Rashid al-Din Sinan, the old man of the mountain, had himself entered his tent, Saladin's nerves gave way. He sent a message to Sinan asking for forgiveness and promised not to pursue his campaign against the assassins provided he was granted safe conduct. Saladin was pardoned and hastened back to Cairo. The Templars and the Old Man of the Mountain. The one effective organization against the assassins was the Templars. Being an undying corporate body, the Templars could not be intimidated by the death of one of their members. The assassins themselves admitted that they never killed a Grand Master because they knew that someone equally good would be put in his place. In their hatred of the Sunni, the assassins sometimes found themselves in alliance with the Christians, and even under trying circumstances they were tolerated by the Crusader states and the Templars. After the assassins murdered Raymond II, the Count of Tripoli, in 1152. For no reason that anyone could figure out, unless they had been hired by Raymond's wife, the Templars threatened to go after the assassins, who readily agreed to pay an annual tribute of 2,000 besants as a form of protection money. The assassins and the Christians shared a common enemy, and it was in their interest to keep the peace with one another. But on one significant occasion, the Templars' distrust of the assassins led them to oppose the policy of King Amalric of Jerusalem, who had entered into talks with the Old Man of the Mountain. The Ismailis had always seen their leaders as the embodiment of emanations flowing from the unknowable God, but in 1164, in an apocalyptic moment, Rashid al-Din Sinan openly renounced Islam and declared that the resurrection had arrived. The contemporary Syrian chronicler Kamal al-Din described scenes of wild frenzy in the Jebel al-Sariya, where men and women mingled in drinking sessions. No man abstained from his sister or daughter. The women wore men's clothes, and one of them declared that Sinan was God. In fact, the divine status accorded to the Old Man of the Mountain was general, according to the Spanish Muslim traveler Ibn Jubayr, who wrote that all his followers treated him as God. It was 9 years after these events, in 1173, that Amalric attempted to negotiate an alliance with Sinan, one of its conditions being that the assassins would convert to Christianity. But as Sinan's envoy was returning from Jerusalem to Masyaf, bearing a safe conduct from Amalric, he was ambushed and killed by some Templar knights. Only with the greatest difficulty was Amalric able to persuade Sinan that the attack was not of his doing. Meanwhile, he accused the Templars of treason and of bringing the kingdom to the edge of ruin by destroying the chance of an advantageous alliance. The chronicler William of Tyre implied that the murder was prompted by a financial motive, for peace would have meant an end to the tribute paid by the assassins to the Templars. Another chronicler, Walter Map, wrote that the Templars killed the envoy, lest, it is said, the belief of the infidels should be done away and peace and union reign. In other words, war justified the existence of the Templars, who feared the outbreak of peace. The argument of Templar greed is typical of William of Tyre, for the order did not need the assassins' tribute. However, the Templars were likely concerned that King Amalric was being duped, for they understood that whatever religion the assassins professed, it would be no more than an outer garment, just as Islam had been an outer garment, as the assassins saw this world as mere illusion, and despite any conversion to Christianity, their inner and secret beliefs would remain. The Templars controlled important castles adjacent to the assassin enclave, castles that also controlled the passes to the yet more dangerous Sunni-held interior, and to have let their guard down, on the word of such a sect, would have been grossly irresponsible and cost the Templars their credibility in the West. In the event, the negotiations were never resumed. After Amalric died in 1174, Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, was made regent, and as his own father had been murdered by the assassins, he shared the Templars' distrust. In the decades following the Second Crusade, visitors to the Temple Mount were impressed with how it was being developed by the Knights Templar. After prayers at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with its chapels associated with the crucifixion and burial of Jesus and the discovery of the true cross, pilgrims walked to the Temple Mount, entering through the western gate near the south side of the Dome of the Rock, the Templum Domini, or Temple of the Lord, a church served by canons of the Augustinian order. On the outer court, the canons and Templars had built houses and planted gardens. According to Theodoric, a German pilgrim who wrote about his visit to the Holy Land in 1172, the Temple of the Lord bore an inscription that read, "The house of the Lord is well built upon a firm rock," but that as pilgrims were in the habit of chipping away bits of the holy rock, its surface had to be paved with marble, and it was cordoned off by a tall and beautifully worked wrought iron screen, which was put up between the encircling columns. From the Temple of the Lord, continued Theodoric, the pilgrims made their way south to the Templar headquarters at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or rather what he called the Palace of Solomon, which is oblong and supported by columns within like a church, and at the end is round like a sanctuary and covered by a great round dome. This building, with all its appurtenances, has passed into the hands of the Knights Templar, who dwell in it and in the other buildings connected with it, having many magazines of arms, clothing, and food in it, and are ever on the watch to guard and protect the country. They have below them stables for horses built by King Solomon himself in the days of old, adjoining the palace a wondrous and intricate building resting on piers and containing an endless complication of arches and vaults, which stable, we declare, according to our reckoning, could take in 10,000 horses with their grooms. No man could send an arrow from one end of their building to the other, either lengthways or crossways, at one shot with a Balearic bow. Above, it abounds with rooms, solar chambers, and buildings suitable for all manner of uses. Those who walk upon the roof of it find an abundance of gardens, courtyards, antechambers, vestibules, and rainwater cisterns. While down below, it contains a wonderful number of baths, storehouses, granaries, and magazines for the storage of wood and other needful provisions. The southern part of the Temple Mount had therefore become the combined administrative, military, and religious headquarters of the Templars, with a vast stable underneath. The Grand Master had his chambers there, and was attended by his entourage, which included a chaplain, 2 knights, a clerk, a sergeant, a Muslim scribe to act as an interpreter, as well as servants and a cook. The seneschal, the marshal, the commander of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the draper were also here along with their attendants. In addition, there were about 300 Templar knights and 1,000 sergeants in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as well as the native Syrian light cavalry called Turcopoles, who were employed by the order, and numerous auxiliaries, including grooms, blacksmiths, armorers, and stonemasons, and many of these would have been quartered on the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount was a busy place, yet at its heart it was as silent as any monastery, for the Templars followed the canonical hours like any Cistercian or Benedictine monk, rising at 4 for matins and retiring to bed after Compline, attending regular services and prayers in between, eating their meals in silence while listening to readings from the Bible, and otherwise caring for their horses. The so-called Stables of Solomon were in fact a substructure of vaults and arches built by Herod to extend the platform of the mount, and later reconstruction work was undertaken by the Umayyads and the Templars. The Templars indeed used this as a stables, but Theodoric's claim that 10,000 horses could be stabled beneath the mount is an exaggeration. Other travelers estimated the capacity at about 2,000 horses, and allowing space for squires, grooms, and perhaps even pilgrims sleeping there. The number of horses stabled at any one time was more like 500. These warrior monks were a powerful force in the Holy Land, whose defense since the Second Crusade fell increasingly on their shoulders. Contrary to popular belief, the Templars were not fanatics forever in search of battle with the infidel. Generally, they were pragmatic and conservative in their approach to politics and warfare, if anything more so than the counts and kings of Outremer, who were driven by personal and dynastic ambitions in the here and now. In becoming a Knight Templar, each man surrendered his will to the order, as in the words of one recruit, "I, renouncing secular life and its pomp, relinquishing everything, give myself to the Lord God and to the knighthood of the Temple of Solomon of Jerusalem, that as long as I shall live, in accordance with my strength, I shall serve there a complete pauper for God." Self-will was replaced with service to the order and its aims, and the Templars were playing a long game, dedicated to defending the Holy Land for all time. In any case, conflict in the Middle Ages tended to be more about sieges of cities and castles than battle in the open field, which was unpredictable and risky even under the most favorable circumstances. And in Outremer, patience had its rewards, as it was usually only a matter of time before the uneasy Muslim coalitions against the Christians fell apart. And so it was with confidence that the Templars looked out from their headquarters atop the Temple Mount upon Jerusalem and the future that lay beyond. In his account of the Temple Mount, the 12th century pilgrim Theodoric mentioned some strange underground features. After ascending the Mount, pilgrims arrived at the lower court of the Templum Domini, the Temple of the Lord, formerly the Dome of the Rock, which was built on the site of Solomon's Temple. One mounts from the lower court to the upper one by 22 steps, wrote Theodoric, and from the upper court one enters the temple. In front of these same steps in the lower court there are 25 steps or more, leading down into a great pool, from which it is said there is a subterranean connection with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, through which the holy fire, which is miraculously lighted in that church on Easter even, is said to be brought underground to the temple of the Lord. The first mention of an aperture in the rock was made in AD 333 by a traveler known as the Bordeaux Pilgrim, but the first documented reference to the cave beneath the rock was made by Ibn al-Faqih in 903. Under the rock is a cavern in which the people pray. This cavern is capable of containing 62 persons. A Persian, Nasiri Khusraw, who visited the Dome of the Rock in 1047, described the large cavern under the rock where they burn tapers, which was perhaps the tradition that led Theodoric to make the connection with the miraculous Easter fire at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Ali of Herat, who visited the Temple Mount in 1173 when Jerusalem was under Christian rule, gave this description. Underneath the rock is the cave of the souls. They say that Allah will bring together the souls of all true believers to this spot. You descend to this cave by some 14 steps. The cave of the souls is of the height of a man. Its length extends 11 paces from east to west, and 13 paces from north to south. Muslims say that the souls of the dead can be heard here as they await the Day of Judgment. And according to both Muslim tradition and the Talmud of the Jews, the rock lies at the center of the world. Beneath it is the abyss, where Muslims say the waters of paradise flow, but the Talmud says the waters of the flood rage. In some Jewish traditions, it is also regarded as the place where the Ark of the Covenant stood, and where, when Solomon's temple was destroyed in 587 BC, the Ark was concealed and remains hidden. The Fatimid garrison at Ascalon had controlled the route into the Nile Delta and to Cairo, the same line of attack taken by the Arabs when they invaded Egypt in 640, after their conquest of Syria and Palestine. When King Baldwin III captured Ascalon with Templar help in 1153, it opened the door to Egypt for the Franks. But the opportunity was only seized after Baldwin died in 1162 and was succeeded by his 25-year-old brother Amaric, who on 3 occasions, in 1164, 1167, and 1168, entered Egypt to prevent it falling to Nur al-Din. The Fatimid regime in Cairo had grown weak and unstable, with two viziers vying with one another for control over the enfeebled caliphs. Each of the viziers reached outside Egypt for support, drawing Amalric in Jerusalem and Nur al-Din in Damascus into their quarrel. For the Franks, the prize was potentially enormous. By installing a friendly government in Cairo, the Kingdom of Jerusalem would not only gain access to the vast resources of Egypt, but would also protect its southern flank. But the prize was no less great for Nur al-Din. Not only would his acquisition of Egypt give him control over the trade route from Damascus that terminated in Cairo, but he would entirely surround the Christian states. Each side had grounds for hope. Alaric understood that for the Fatimids, who were both Shia and Arab, their greatest enemy was not his Christian kingdom, but Nur al-Din, who was a Sunni and a Seljuk Turk. But though 2 centuries of Fatimid rule meant that Shia influences were strong in Egypt, Nur al-Din knew that the mass of Egyptians remained Sunni, and he counted on the shared Muslim bond between Cairo and Damascus. For 5 years, this contest was waged between Amalric and Shirkuh, the Kurdish general commanding Nur al-Din's army. If either rival won Egypt to its side, the gain could be decisive. Amalric had large contingents of Templars in his army when he twice, in 1164 and 1167, forced Shirkuh to withdraw from Egypt and then withdrew himself. A leading Templar also took part in the mission, which negotiated the Treaty of Alliance between Amalric and Shawar, the Fatimid vizier, prior to the Franks' military intervention in 1167. But by then, the fundamental weakness of the Fatimid regime was obvious to both Nur al-Din and Amalric, and it was only a matter of time before one of them would strike the coup de grace. Amalric struck first, marching into Egypt in 1168 with the intention of outright annexation, without the support of Templar forces. The Fatimids withdrew within the walls of Cairo and burnt its suburbs to the ground, and they sent for help to Nur al-Din. This time it was Amalric who was forced to withdraw, and Nur al-Din's Kurdish general Shirkuh entered Cairo, decapitated Shawar, and installed himself as vizier. His rule was not long. In March 1169, Shirkuh died and was succeeded as vizier by his nephew Salah al-Din, better known in the West as Saladin. The capture of Egypt by Nur al-Din's forces was a strategic calamity for the Franks. Why the Templars refused to participate in Amalric's 1168 invasion has been a matter of speculation and debate. Again, the earliest principal source for these events is William of Tyre, who was commissioned by Amalric to write his history of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and might have been expected to fiercely condemn the Templars. Yet William himself disapproved of the campaign and said that the Templars objected on moral grounds. It seemed against their conscience to break the treaty which they had helped negotiate with Shawar in 1167. What William did not mention, though it was true, was that the Templars were financially connected with the Muslims and with the Italian merchants, who carried on a greater trade with Egypt than with all the Crusader ports combined. William confined his criticism to the suggestion that the Templars may have been jealous of the Hospitallers, who had taken the lead in urging Amalric to undertake the expedition and had already claimed Pelusium on the edge of the Egyptian delta for themselves. The perpetual rivalry between the two orders was a problem. It was seldom that they could be induced to campaign together, and each followed its own line, regardless of the official policy of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. For all the strategic importance of Egypt, there were other strategic considerations that the Templars would reasonably have taken into account. In 1164, when the bulk of Templar forces had been with Amalric on campaign in Egypt, Nur al-Din had taken advantage by striking in the north, inflicting heavy losses against the army of the Prince of Antioch, which included the deaths of 60 Templar knights and numerous more sergeants and Turcopoles. precisely in the area where the Templars bore responsibility for manning strategically sited castles that were part of the ultimate defense of Outremer. The experience may have impressed upon the Templars the need to husband their resources and concentrate them where they were most needed. Certainly there were strong differences over military strategy between Amalric and the Templars, with William of Tyre describing a dramatic incident that occurred in 1166. Learning that a Templar garrison was under siege beyond the Jordan, Amalric rode out to relieve them with a large force. But when he reached the river, he was told that what William describes as an impregnable cave had already fallen to Nur al-Din's general Shirkuh. The Templars may have thought that their garrison was out on a limb too far, but outraged and confounded by the news, Amalric hanged 12 of the Templars who had surrendered to Shirkuh. Add to this the story of the assassin's envoy killed by the Templars in 1173, an event, according to William of Tyre, that brought the kingdom to the edge of irrevocable ruin as it cost Jerusalem an ally against encircling Sunni power. And there is a pattern of Templar willfulness in military, political, and religious matters. The Hospitallers could be no less independent of secular authority, but their image was softened by the alms and care they lavished on pilgrims, whereas the image of the Templars rested more exclusively on their military prowess, and then there was their involvement in financial activities. The independence of the orders was liable to provoke resentment, and in the case of the Templars, it led increasingly to criticism that the order was primarily concerned with protecting and advancing its own interests. An unknown pilgrim visiting Jerusalem sometime after the middle of the 12th century described the Templars as follows. "The Templars are most excellent soldiers. They wear white mantles with a red cross, and when they go to the wars, a standard of 2 colors called balzaus is borne before them. They go in silence. Their first attack is the most terrible. In going, they are the first. In returning, the last. They await the orders of their master. When they think fit to make war and the trumpet has sounded, they sing in chorus the Psalm of David, 'Not unto us, O Lord,' kneeling on the blood and necks of the enemy, unless they have forced the troops of the enemy to retire altogether or utterly broken them to pieces. Should any of them for any reason turn his back to the enemy, or come forth alive from a defeat, or bear arms against the Christians, he is severely punished. The white mantle with the red cross, which is the sign of his knighthood, is taken away with ignominy. He is cast from the society of brethren, and eats his food on the floor without a napkin for the space of 1 year. If the dogs molest him, he does not dare to drive them away. But at the end of the year, if the master and brethren think his penance to have been sufficient, they restore him the belt of his former knighthood. These Templars live under a strict religious rule, obeying humbly, having no private property, eating sparingly, dressing meanly, and dwelling in tents. In 1171, as the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid lay dying, prayers rose from the mosques of Cairo, but not for the last of Egypt's Shia rulers, instead for Nur al-Din's puppet, the Sunni Caliph in Baghdad. Notional Abbasid rule was reimposed on Egypt. In reality, al-Adid was the last Arab ruler in the Middle East, and the once imperial Arabs were now governed by Turks and Kurds. Saladin continued in the office of vizier, supposedly ruling Egypt on behalf of Nur al-Din, but in effect ruling Egypt for himself. To consolidate his position, Saladin began constructing the citadel of Cairo and extended the city walls. When Nur al-Din died in 1174, Saladin declared himself Sultan in Egypt and rushed to seize Damascus. The Christians were now reaping the consequences of their failure to take Egypt. For the first time, they were surrounded by a united Muslim power. Moreover, the able Amalric had died in 1174 and was succeeded by his young son Baldwin IV, who suffered from leprosy. By the end of 1177, Saladin was ready to strike, and in November he crossed the frontier from Egypt. The Templars summoned all their available knights to defend Gaza, but Saladin bypassed them for Ascalon. Raising what men-at-arms he could, Baldwin rushed to block him, and together with the True Cross and the commander of his army, Reynold of Chatillon, he managed to get inside the walls of Ascalon before Saladin arrived. But instead of attacking, Saladin left a small force to besiege Ascalon and marched towards an undefended Jerusalem with 30,000 men, though the figure is probably exaggerated. Sending a message to the Templars, Baldwin told them to abandon Gaza and join him. When they came near, Baldwin broke out of Ascalon and chased after Saladin, marching north along the coast and then inland. On 25 November, Saladin's army was crossing a ravine at Montgisar near Ramleh, close by the Jaffa-Jerusalem road, when Baldwin and the Templars fell upon them, taking them by surprise. The king himself was in the vanguard, and Reynold of Chatillon and Balian of Ibelin helped on the victory, and some saw St. George himself, whose church was nearby at Lydda, fighting by their side. The Christian force comprised 450 knights, 80 of them Templars, and a few thousand infantry, and they lost about 1,100 men. But they inflicted on Saladin's forces an overwhelming defeat, killing 90% of his army. Saladin himself only narrowly managing to escape back to Egypt, where, to cling to power, he spread the lie that the Christians had lost the battle. The Battle of Montgisard had been a great victory, and it saved the Kingdom of Jerusalem for the moment. But it did not alter the fundamental situation. Against the vast resources of Egypt on which Saladin could draw, the Franks were short of men, and it was dangerous to risk their army on offensive operations. Had Baldwin the forces to pursue the enemy to Cairo or to make a sudden attack on Damascus, he might have destroyed Saladin with a crushing blow. Instead, he decided to reinforce his defenses along the Syrian frontier, and at the insistence of the Templars, he built the castle of Chastelet to control a ford across the upper Jordan, where Jacob of the Old Testament was said to have wrestled with the angel, Genesis 32:24. But lacking neither resources nor resolution, Saladin kept up the pressure on the Damascus front, laid siege to Chastelet in June 1179 and again in August 1179, succeeded in mining the castle walls, then executed its 700 defenders and razed it to the ground. Faced with an extreme drought that was threatening harvests throughout Syria and Outremer, in May 1180, Baldwin and Saladin agreed a 2-year truce. For Saladin, this was convenient, as it allowed him to pursue his siege of Aleppo, which was in the hands of Nur al-Din's son. For Baldwin, it bought time, and for Christian and Muslim traders, the truce meant that they could pass freely through each other's territory. But the treaty was broken the following year by Reynold of Chatillon, a bold and able soldier who was lord of Outre-Jourdain, which lay astride Saladin's line of communication between Cairo and Damascus. From his castle of Kerak, he could see the rich Muslim caravans traveling to Medina and Mecca, and falling upon one of these, he made off with all its goods. Saladin complained to Baldwin and demanded compensation, but Reynold refused to make restitution. In 1182, Reynold took matters further when he launched a fleet of ships into the Gulf of Aqaba and down the Red Sea, where they raided Egyptian and Arabian ports, including those of Mecca and Medina, until they were driven back by a naval force under the command of Saladin's brother. The concept of chivalry, the word derives from chevalier, the French for knight, arose in Western Europe in the century leading up to the First Crusade. A moral, religious, and social code, chivalry emphasized the virtues of courage, service, and honor. Combined with piety and faith, it found expression in the Crusades. Godfrey of Bouillon, the leader of the First Crusade, was widely seen as an exemplar of knightly virtues, and the chroniclers celebrated Baldwin, his brother and successor, for the chivalry he showed after capturing the wife of a Muslim prince, and upon discovering she was pregnant, immediately sending her back to her husband with every mark of respect. Saladin came to admire the chivalrous code of the Frankish knights, and he acted with courtesy and sometimes clemency in return. There was the famous instance when he laid siege to Raymond of Chatillon's castle of Carac. A marriage was being celebrated within, and when Raymond's wife sent trays of the festive meal to Saladin outside, he tactfully inquired in which chamber the bridal couple were lodged, so that he would not bombard them on their wedding night. For gestures such as these, Saladin became a legend throughout Christendom, a worthy and honorable adversary, a phenomenon some naively explained by supposing that he must have had an English mother. In fact, Saladin was following the precepts of Islam's own version of chivalry called futuwa, which roughly means nobility. But in reality, chivalrous relations were rarely the rule between the Crusaders and the Muslims. The massacre perpetrated by the Crusaders at the fall of Jerusalem in 1099 was disgraceful, but it was hardly an exceptional event. Populations that did not surrender were marked down for death or slavery, as Zengi showed when he captured Edessa in 1144, or as the Mamelukes would show when they stormed Acre in 1291 and beheaded every last person in the city. Not that surrender was a guarantee. The Mameluke Sultan Baybars, in spite of his oath, murdered nearly 1,000 prisoners after the fall of Safed in 1266. Saladin could be ruthless, and in the interests of policy he did not shrink from bloodshed. He was a devout Muslim who abhorred free thinkers, and though he made many friends among the Christians, he never doubted that their souls were doomed to damnation. His famous magnanimity lay partly in his humanity, but was also a matter of calculation. He did not shrink from cruelty when it suited his policy of instilling fear and asserting his dominance over his adversaries. In Cairo, he ordered the crucifixion of his Shia opponents, and he was not averse to mutilating and executing his captives, as after the Battle of Hattin, when he slaughtered his Hospitaller and Templar captives in cold blood. It seems to have been only the threat made by the Frankish defenders of Jerusalem in 1187 that they would destroy all the sacred places, everything atop the Temple Mount, that caused Saladin to prefer a negotiated surrender to his original intention of purifying the city with Christian blood. Behind the scenes of these events was a growing division within Outremer between those who wanted to pursue an aggressive policy towards Saladin and those who sought accommodation. Among the former was Reynald of Chatillon, while among the latter was Count Raymond III of Tripoli and the slowly dying king. But Saladin had his own policy, which was to annihilate the Christian states, and their internal differences only made it easier for Saladin to destroy them. But for the moment the forces of Outremer were able to make a united stand against Saladin, who in May 1182, at the expiry of the truce, rode out with an invasion army from Cairo. Baldwin, who was now almost blind and had to be carried in a litter, was waiting with his army on the west bank of the Jordan, accompanied by Heraclius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and the True Cross. Following a fierce battle, Saladin was repelled but not defeated, and both sides claimed victory. The following June, however, Saladin finally captured Aleppo, and with it he gained full control of Syria. Not for 2 centuries had there been such a powerful Muslim ruler, his territories stretching from North Africa to the Tigris. Now, Saladin was ready to unleash his jihad against the Christians. With Outremer encircled, the Templar and Hospitaller Grand Masters set sail in 1184, together with Heraclius, to seek help from the west. The kings of France and England and the Holy Roman Emperor received them with honor and discussed plans for a great crusade. But they gave pressing domestic reasons for not going to the east themselves, and instead they paid barely sufficient money to cover the cost of a few hundred knights for a year. While in London, early in 1185, Heraclius consecrated the new Temple Church, the one that stands there to this day. But the Templar Grand Master did not get that far. He had fallen ill en route and died at Verona. At about the same time as Heraclius was consecrating the new Templar church in London, Gerard of Riedefort was elected the new Grand Master by the Templars in Jerusalem, his elevation coinciding with the culmination of the factional disputes within the kingdom. Baldwin IV died in March 1185 and was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and his successor, the child king Baldwin V, died in 1186, not yet 9 years old. Raymond III of Tripoli, leader of the party seeking accommodation with Saladin, had been the boy's regent according to his father's will, which also stated that if the child died before the age of 10, Raymond was to remain as regent until a new king was chosen through the arbitration of the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the kings of France and England. Instead, the boy's mother Sibylla, who was the sister of the leper king, claimed the throne for herself and her husband, Guy of Lusignan. Backed by the party that supported an aggressive policy towards Saladin. Among them, Reynald of Châtillon, the Lord of Ultrajourdan, Gerard of Riedefort, the Grand Master of the Templars, and Heraclius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, who had also been the lover of Sibylla's mother Sibylla, and Guy were quickly crowned at Jerusalem. All the barons of Outremer accepted what in effect was a coup d'état, all except Raymond of Tripoli, who felt he had been cheated of the kingship, and his close ally Balian of Ibelin. Going from factional rivalry to treason, Count Raymond of Tripoli entered into a secret treaty with Saladin. Not only did it apply to Tripoli itself, but also to his wife's Principality of Galilee, even though it was part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which might soon be at war with the Muslims. Saladin also promised his support for Raymond's aim to overthrow Sibylla and Guy of Lusignan and make himself king. In April 1187, Guy responded by summoning his loyal barons and marching north to Galilee to reduce it to submission before the expected Muslim attack began. But Balian of Ibelin, fearing the consequences of civil war, persuaded Guy to let him lead a delegation to Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee and try to negotiate a reconciliation between Raymond and the king. The delegation would include the Grand Masters of the Hospitallers and the Templars, and Balian would meet them at the Templar castle of La Fève on 1st May. Meanwhile, Saladin had asked Raymond's permission to send a reconnaissance party of Mameluke slave troops through Galilee on that day, and though the timing was embarrassing, Raymond was obliged to agree under the terms of the secret treaty, stipulating only that the Muslims should traverse his territory within the day and be gone by dark, and do no harm to any town or village. Raymond broadcast the news that the Muslim party would be passing through and urged his people to stay indoors. But Balian had heard nothing of this when he arrived at La Fève in the middle of the morning on 1st May, expecting to join the Grand Masters there. Instead, he found the castle empty, and after waiting in the silence for an hour or two, he set out again towards Tiberias, thinking the others had gone ahead, when suddenly a bleeding Templar knight galloped by, shouting out news of a great disaster. Raymond of Tripoli's message about the Muslim party had reached La Fève in the evening of the previous day, 30 April, where Gerard of Riedefort heard the news. At once he summoned the Templars from the surrounding neighborhood, and by nightfall 90 had joined him there. In the morning they rode north through Nazareth, where 40 secular knights joined the hunt for the enemy's scouting party. But as they passed over the hill behind Nazareth, what they saw was a large expedition of perhaps 7,000 elite Mameluke horsemen watering their mounts at the springs of Cresson in the valley below. Both the Templar Marshal and the Hospitaller Grand Master advised retreat, but Gerard of Riedefort, the Templar Grand Master, insisted on attack. Charging furiously down the hillside, the 130 knights rode into the mass of the Muslim cavalry and were slaughtered almost to a man, only 3 Templars, Gerard among them, escaping with their lives. That at any rate was the account given by an anonymous chronicler who obtained much of his information from the lost chronicle of Ernoul, who was a member of Balian's entourage. But neither Balian nor Ernoul were at the battle, and any account issuing from Balian's camp was likely to paint their factional opponent, Gerard of Ridefort, in the worst possible light. Another chronicle, the Itinerarium Regius Ricardi, apparently based on the lost journal of an English knight writing in about 1191, contradicts the story that Gerard rushed recklessly at the enemy. Instead, and much more plausibly, it reports that the Templars were caught unaware and were the victims of a Muslim attack. Even so, Saladin's expedition kept to his agreement with Raymond of Tripoli, for his horsemen rode home long before nightfall, and they had not harmed a town or village in Galilee. But fixed to the lances of the Mamluk vanguard were the heads of the Templar Knights. Shamed by this tragedy, which was much his doing, Raymond of Tripoli broke his treaty with Saladin and rode to Jerusalem, where he made his peace with the king. The peril was far too great for Guy of Lusignan to do anything but welcome Raymond's renewed loyalty to the kingdom, for at that moment Saladin was gathering a great army just over the frontier. Guy called every able-bodied man to arms at Acre, emptying the cities and castles of fighting men. At 12,000 strong, including 1,200 mounted knights, the army was all that Outremer had to give. Against this, Saladin had drawn on the Turkish and Kurdish occupiers of Egypt, Iraq, and Syria, along with their Mameluke slave troops and some Arabs too, for his invasion force of 18,000 men, and on 1st July 1187 he crossed the Jordan at Sanabra, where it issues from the southern end of the freshwater lake known as the Sea of Galilee. On the following day, as Saladin was laying siege to Tiberias, the Crusader army settled in a good defensive position, well watered and with plenty of pasturage for the horses, 15 miles to the west at Sephoria. The Templars and the Hospitallers were there, also Raymond, the Count of Tripoli, and Reynald of Chatillon, Balian of Ibelin, and many other lords with all their men, together with the Bishop of Acre, who carried the true cross. And the plan they had all agreed with the king was to wait, confident that Saladin could not hold his large army together in the parched countryside for very long during the heat of summer. But that evening, a message arrived from Raymond's wife, Eschiva, the Countess of Tripoli, telling how she was at Tiberias, holding out against Saladin's attack. King Guy held a council in his tent, where many of the knights were moved by her desperate situation and wanted the army to march to her rescue. But Raymond rose and spoke, saying it would be foolhardy to abandon their present strong position and make a hazardous march through barren country in the fierce July heat. "Tiberias is my city and my wife is there," spoke Raymond, according to the chronicle De Expugnatione Terrae Sanctae per Saladinum. "None of you is so fiercely attached save to Christianity as I am to the city. None of you is so desirous as I am to succor or aid Tiberias. We and the king, however, should not move away from water, food, and other necessities to lead such a multitude of men to death from solitude, hunger, thirst, and scorching heat. You are well aware that since the heat is searing and the number of people is large, they could not survive half a day without an abundance of water. Furthermore, they could not reach the enemy without suffering a great shortage of water, accompanied by the destruction of men and of beasts. Stay, therefore, at this midway point, close to food and water, for certainly the Saracens have risen to such heights of pride that when they have taken the city, they will not turn aside to left or right, but will head straight through the vast solitude to us and challenge us to battle. Then our men, refreshed and filled with bread and water, will cheerfully set out from camp for the fray. We and our horses will be fresh. We will be aided and protected by the Lord's cross. Thus we will fight mightily against an unbelieving people who will be wearied by thirst and who will have no place to refresh themselves. Thus you see that if, in truth, the grace of Jesus Christ remains with us, the enemies of Christ's cross, before they can get to the sea or return to the river, will be taken captive, or else killed by sword, by lance, or by thirst. By the time the council broke up at midnight, it had resolved to remain at Sephoria. But Raymond's earlier treaty with Saladin had created an atmosphere of bitterness and mistrust among some, and his motives were now suspect. Later that same night, the Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard of Ridefort, came to the king's tent and said that Raymond was a traitor, and that to abandon Tiberias, which lay so close by, would be a stain on Guy's honor, as it would be on the Templars' own, if they left unavenged the deaths of so many of their brothers at the springs of Cresson. At this, the king overturned the council's decision and announced that the army would march at dawn. There were two ways to Tiberias, the one Saladin had taken via Sanabria along the shores of the Galilee Lake, the other across the parched hill country to the north. Leaving the gardens of Sephoria behind in the morning of 3rd July, the Christian army marched across the barren hills towards the climbing sun. The day was hot and airless, and the men and horses suffered terribly, for there was no water along the road. Guy was at the center of the column, and the Templars brought up the rear. As Raymond of Tripoli held Galilee in fief from the king, it was his prerogative to lead the way. This led some to find treachery in the choice of route, for the choice was his. There may have been treachery from some quarter, for Saladin quickly discovered the line of the Franks' advance, warned, it was said, by several secular knights, and sent skirmishers to harass and weary the vanguard and rear guard with flights of arrows, while he himself marched his army the 5 miles from Tiberias to Hattin, a well-watered village amid broad pastures situated where the road across the hills descended towards the lake. By the afternoon, the Christian army had reached the plateau above Hattin, and here Raymond said they should camp. There was water there, he thought, but the spring turned out to be dry. According to one version, it was the Templars, who said they could go no further, and the king who made the decision to set up camp, causing Raymond to cry out, "Alas, Lord God, the battle is over. We have been betrayed unto death. The kingdom is finished." Between the Franks and the village, from where the ground fell away towards the lake, rose a hill with 2 summits. It was called the Horns of Hattin. There, on the waterless plateau, the Christian army spent the night, their misery made worse by the smoke and flames from the dry scrub on the hillside that the Muslims had set alight. Under cover of darkness, Saladin's forces crept closer. Any Franks who slipped away in search of water were killed, and by dawn the Christian army was surrounded on all sides. Soon after daybreak, on 4th July 1187, Saladin attacked. Against him charged the Christian infantry, desperate to break through his lines to reach water, but they were killed or driven back. So goes the account in one chronicle, but in another they simply ran away and refused to fight. By all accounts, the knights put up a terrific fight and repeatedly checked Saladin's cavalry attacks. But their real enemy was thirst, and as their strength failed them, their numbers were diminished. The Templars and the Hospitallers gathered round the king and the true cross, where they were surrounded by the confusion and press of battle, the Expugnatione describing how the Christians were jumbled together and mingled with the Turks. It goes on to tell how the king, seeing that all was lost, cried out that those who could escape should do so before it was too late. At this, Raymond of Tripoli and Balian of Ibelin with their men charged the enemy line, hoping to break through. The speed of their horses in this confined space trampled down the Christians and made a kind of bridge, giving the riders a level path. In this manner they got out of that narrow place by fleeing over their own men, over the Turks, and over the cross. As they bore down on Saladin's line, it opened and let them pass through, then closed again. They were the last to get away. Soon the battle was over. The true cross fell to Muslim hands. King Guy and those around him gave way to exhaustion and were taken. Saladin's tent was set up on the battlefield, and here the king and his surviving barons were brought before their conqueror. Seating the king next to him, Saladin handed Guy a cup of water to slake his thirst. It also was a sign, for it was the custom that to give food or drink to a captive meant that his life was spared. But when Guy passed the water to Reynald of Châtillon, Saladin told the king, "You gave the man the drink, not I." Then he turned angrily on Reynald, reminding him of his brigandage and his raids down the Red Sea coast to the ports of Medina and Mecca, and accused him of blasphemy. When Saladin offered Reynald the choice between conversion to Islam and death, Reynald replied that it was Saladin who should convert to Christianity to avoid the eternal damnation that awaited unbelievers, at which Saladin struck off his head. The others were taken to captivity at Damascus, where those who were worth a handsome ransom were treated well, the remainder sold into slavery. Saladin was not so clement towards the military orders. Though Gerard of Rydfort, the Templars' Grand Master, was among the prisoners taken to Damascus, the other monastic knights faced a different fate. Frankish nobles were irresponsible, thoughtless, petty, and covetous, thought al-Hawari, who wrote a military treatise for Saladin, qualities which allowed them to be manipulated to suit Saladin's purposes. But the Templars and Hospitallers were dangerous because they have great fervor in religion, paying no attention to the things of this world. 2 days after his victory, wrote his secretary Imad al-Din, who was an eyewitness to the event, Saladin sought out the Templars and Hospitallers who had been captured and said, "I shall purify the land of these 2 impure races." He assigned 50 dinar to every man who had taken one of them prisoner, and immediately the army brought forward at least 100 of them. He ordered that they should be beheaded, choosing to have them dead rather than in prison. With him was a whole band of scholars and Sufis and a certain number of devout men and ascetics. Each begged to be allowed to kill one of them, and drew his sword and rolled back his sleeve. Saladin, his face joyful, was sitting on his dais. The unbelievers showed black despair. The Battle of the Chronicles. What really happened at the battles of the springs of Cresson and of Hattin, and what happened at Saladin's siege of Jerusalem? There are several sources. Some are eyewitness accounts, some are worked up after the events they describe. All of them are biased, and they are often flatly contradictory. Reading them, it is possible to portray the Templars as rash and irresponsible or as defiant heroes, to see Raymond of Tripoli as a wise advisor or a traitor to the king, and to imagine Balian of Ibelin not as the bold defender of Jerusalem, but as a collaborator with Saladin. Clearly there were 2 factions as Outremer was confronted by the crisis of Saladin's onslaught, and that fact alone was a serious weakness. One of the most important documents is the so-called Chronicle of Ernoul. In fact, the entire chronicle is lost, but a number of similar manuscripts seem to derive from a single original account by Ernoul, who was a squire to Balian of Ibelin. Some see Ernoul as an apologist for Balian, for people would wonder how he escaped unscathed from the Battle of Hattin. Ernoul blames Raymond for having chosen the camping ground where the well turned out to be dry. But he also defends Raymond, as well as Balian, from breaking through the Muslim lines and escaping from the battlefield at Hattin, saying they were acting under the command of the king. Ernoul directs his strongest criticism at Gerard of Rydfort, the Grand Master of the Templars, for his recklessness at the springs of Cresson and for urging the army forward across the hot and waterless landscape towards the horns of Hattin. This description of events puts in the most favorable light that faction in Outremer, who opposed the crowning of Guy of Lusignan as king. In contrast, the anonymous De Expugnatione Terrae Sanctae per Saladinum shows admiration for the military orders while describing the flight from the battlefield at Hattin by Balian, Raymond, and others in a none too flattering light. Nevertheless, it is sympathetic to Raymond and presents him as a wise counselor on the eve of battle, and it is very likely that its author was an Englishman who was one of Raymond's men. The Expugnation also gives an eyewitness account of the siege of Jerusalem, in which it manages to suggest the suspicion that Balian had been sent to the city by Saladin himself. His task to convince its inhabitants to arrive at a negotiated surrender. Another work, the Itinerarium Regis Ricardi, was quite possibly based on a lost journal kept by an English Templar and rejects any criticism of the orders. Far from being rash, the actions of the Templar Grand Master Gerard of Ridefort showed him to be a man consistent in his refusal to compromise with the Muslims, but he was undermined by Raymond of Tripoli, whom the Itinerarium blames for the disaster at Hattin, saying that he lured the army on because he had a secret deal with Saladin. This accusation of treachery against Raymond clears the king and the faction gathered round him of the blame for subsequently losing Jerusalem. On the Muslim side, an account by Saladin's secretary Imad al-Din is authoritative. He was an eyewitness at the heart of events, but he knew little about the inner workings of the Franks. The towns and cities and castles had been emptied to defend the Holy Land against the Muslim invasion. Now, after the Battle of Hattin, Outremer stood almost entirely defenseless against Saladin. Acre surrendered without a fight on 10th July, Sidon followed suit on the 29th, and Beirut capitulated on 6th of August. Jaffa refused to yield. In July it was taken by storm, and its entire population were killed or sent to the slave markets and harems of Aleppo. Ascalon offered some brief resistance, but surrendered on 4th of September. A few days later, Saladin brought Gerard of Ridefort to the walls of Gaza and made him tell the Templars inside to surrender, which, obedient to their Grand Master, they promptly did. In the south, only Tyre resisted capture. In the north, there was Tripoli, Tortosa, and Antioch, and they could be dealt with later. Saladin's immediate aim was to take Jerusalem. Refugees were flooding into Jerusalem, but there were few fighters among the men, and for every man there were said to be 50 women and children. The Patriarch Heraclius, together with officials of the military orders, tried to prepare the city's defense. But Jerusalem lacked a leader until Balian of Ibelin appeared. After Hattin, his wife and children had sought safety within its walls, and Balian had come to Jerusalem to bring them to the coast at Tyre. But the people of the city clamored for him to stay, and finally Balian accepted the task of readying Jerusalem against Saladin's attack. His most immediate need was to raise morale. There were only 2 knights left in the city, so Balian knighted every boy over 16 of noble birth and also 30 burgesses. To fund the defense, he took over the royal treasury and even stripped the silver from the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He sent parties out into the areas all around to collect all the food before the Muslims arrived, and he gave arms to every able-bodied man. On 20th September, Saladin was camped outside the city. He inquired about the location of Al-Aqsa Mosque and asked the shortest route to it, saying that was also the shortest route to heaven. Then he set his sappers to work, undermining that section of the northern battlements where Godfrey of Bouillon had forced his way into Jerusalem 88 years before. By 29th September, a great breach was made in the wall which was tenaciously defended, but it was only a matter of time before they would be overwhelmed by Saladin's hordes. Balian, with the support of the Patriarch, decided to seek terms, and on 30th of September, he went to Saladin's tent. Saladin was uncompromising. He had been told by his holy men, he said, that Jerusalem could only be cleansed with Christian blood, and so he had vowed to take Jerusalem by the sword. Only unconditional surrender would make him stay his hand. But Balian warned that unless they were given honorable terms, the defenders in their desperation would destroy everything in the city. "We shall slay our sons and our daughters. We shall burn the city and overthrow the temple and all the sanctuaries which are also your sanctuaries." Saladin consented that Jerusalem's 20,000 Christians could leave the city if they paid him 10 dinars for each man, 5 for each female, and 1 for each boy up to 7 years old. But the poorest would be unable to ransom themselves, and so Balian produced 30,000 dinars from public funds to pay for the release of the poorest 7,000 people. On the 2nd October 1187, the 27th day of Rajab according to the Islamic calendar, and the anniversary of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, the Muslims reoccupied Jerusalem. The Temple Mount was surrendered to Saladin, and the Templars were removed from their headquarters at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The cross erected by the Crusaders on the Dome of the Rock was thrown down before the army of Saladin, and in the presence of the Frankish population. A great cry went up when it fell, of anguish from the Christians and of "Allah is great" from the Muslims, who dragged it round the streets of the city for 2 days, beating it with clubs. The initial euphoria of the victory was followed by a busy week, during which the many structures built by the Templars on the Temple Mount and the modifications they made within the Al-Aqsa Mosque were demolished. Saladin himself oversaw these works, ensuring that the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock were restored to their earlier Islamic character. Finally, both buildings were sprinkled with rose water to cleanse them of Christian pollution. Saladin joined the vast congregation that gathered for Friday prayers on 9th October at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the Qadi of Aleppo gave the sermon in which he compared Saladin's victory to Umar's conquest of the city and other Muslim triumphs going back to Muhammad's battles at Badr against the Meccans and at Khaybar, which led to the expulsion of the Jews from the Arabian Peninsula. "Jerusalem," he continued to the Muslims, "is the residence of your father Abraham, the place of ascension of your prophet, the burial ground of the messengers, and the place of the descent of revelations. It is in the land where men will be resurrected, and it is in the Holy Land to which Allah has referred in the Quran." 2 great lines of Christian refugees were led out from Jerusalem, one bound for slavery, the other freedom. The ransomed refugees were then assembled in 3 groups. Balian and the Patriarch Heraclius took charge of one group. Another was placed in the custody of the Hospitallers, and the third in that of the Templars. After one last look back at Jerusalem and the brow of the Temple Mount, the refugees were led to the coast, where they were distributed between Antioch, Tyre, and Tripoli. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had suffered a comprehensive defeat from which no feudal monarchy could have emerged with its powers unimpaired. But the military orders, because of their military functions and their external financing, became yet more important and independent than before. This was particularly true of the Templars, whose single-minded policy and purpose was to preserve, to defend, and now to regain Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Defeat at Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem did not diminish the crusading cause. Indeed, crusading thrived on disaster and was fueled by a new enthusiasm. After capturing the Christian coastal ports and Jerusalem in 1187, Saladin turned his attention to northern Syria, where during his campaign of 1188 he stormed one castle after another and took the city of Latakia. But he balked at the key Hospitaller castles of Margat and Crac de Chevalier, and at the Templars' fortified city of Tortosa and their castle at Safita, called Chastel Blanc. More than ever, Outremer relied on castles and on the military orders who manned them, and the power of the orders grew. In fact, at no point in their history would the Templars be more powerful than in the century after nearly everything in the Holy Land was lost to Saladin. The West reacted with shock to the loss of Jerusalem and responded by launching the Third Crusade in 1190. in a remarkable series of victories, first Philip II of France and Richard I of England, known as the Lion Heart, recovered Acre in July 1191. And then Richard went on to take Jaffa and Ascalon as well, after defeating Saladin in a great battle at Arsuf in September 1191, in which the military orders played a leading role. Richard the Lionheart marched to within sight of Jerusalem, but was advised by both the Templar and the Hospitaller Grand Masters that even if he took the city, it could not be held without also controlling the hinterland, especially once his army had left Outremer. Richard took their advice and instead came to an agreement with Saladin. The Franks would demolish the walls of Ascalon, while Saladin would recognize the Christian positions along the coast. Free movement would be allowed to Christians and Muslims across each other's territory, and Christian pilgrims would be permitted to visit Jerusalem and the other holy places. In name and number, the revived Crusader states were as before, but their outlines were diminished. There was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, though its capital was at Acre, which the Templars made their new headquarters. To the north was the county of Tripoli, but the Muslims retained control of the Syrian coast around Latakia for some time, and so the Principality of Antioch further to the north was now no longer contiguous to the other Crusade estates. Nevertheless, the Third Crusade, in which Richard relied heavily on the Templars, had saved the Holy Land for the Christians and went a long way towards restoring Frankish fortunes. Accompanied by a Templar escort, Richard left the Holy Land in 1192, and in the following year, Saladin died. Peace settled over Outremer, and its immediate future looked secure. The Templar Grand Master Gerard of Riedefort, who had been captured by Saladin and then released in 1187, received a last acclaim from the anonymous English knight on whose lost journal the Itinerarium Regis Ricardi was based. The chronicle records Gerard's death in 1189 during an abortive attempt to retake Acre, and says that the Grand Master was crowned with the laurel of martyrdom, which he had merited in so many wars. The lost journal may well have been written by a Templar serving with Richard I of England during the Third Crusade. In any case, the new crusade certainly marked the close association of the Templars with the English king. Robert of Sablé became Grand Master of the Templars in 1191, almost certainly through the influence of King Richard, whose vassal he had been. On his way to the Holy Land, Richard paused to capture Cyprus from the Byzantines, but lacking the means to control the island, he sold it to the Templars, a transaction that probably owed something to the already close link between Robert of Sablé and the king. The entire future of the Templars might have been different had they devoted more resources to the island, but they placed only 20 knights on Cyprus and another 100 men-at-arms, insufficient to secure it, and so they gave it back to Richard. Possessing a territory of their own, the Templars would have anticipated the achievement of the Knights Hospitaller, who established their own independent state on Rhodes in 1309. Instead, Templar fortunes remained tied to the Holy Land, and when it fell, the Templars fell soon after. Meanwhile, the Templars were invaluable to Richard the Lionheart, never more so than when he relied on their steadiness and discipline to help him win his great victory over Saladin in the Battle of Arsuf on 7 September 1191. As Richard marched south along the coast from Acre, his army was vulnerable to flank attacks by Saladin's Turkish cavalry, and it was thanks to the Templars and the Hospitallers that the Turks were beaten off, and the coherence of the Christian column was maintained, much as the Templars had done for Louis VII during his march across Asia Minor during the Second Crusade. On the battlefield itself, Richard placed the Templars at the front rank of his army, the Hospitallers at the rear. Richard's plan was for his army to stand firm while Saladin's forces wore themselves out in attack. And so it went. Beginning with wave after wave of lightly armed black and Bedouin infantry rushing against the Christian lines, followed by charging Turkish horsemen swinging their scimitars and axes. And still the knights held their ground, Richard waiting for the moment when the Muslim charges showed signs of weakening. The Templars withstood everything thrown at them. The Hospitallers broke ranks first. Unwilling to endure the assaults any longer, they rode out against the enemy, and then the whole army followed suit. Saladin's secretary, Imad al-Din, who watched the battle from a nearby hill, gasped at the splendor of the spectacle as Richard's cavalry thundered forwards, with the king himself at the center, restoring order and taking command of the battle. Arsuf was a tremendous moral victory for the Franks and a public humiliation of Saladin, a small repayment for the Templars he slaughtered after the Battle of Hattin. The victory also partly resurrected the Kingdom of Jerusalem. After the death of Saladin, his empire fell apart. Rival factions of his dynasty, the Ayyubids, Ayyub being Saladin's father's name, ruled in Cairo and Damascus, but all the rest was lost. Occasional skirmishes followed between Outremer and the Muslim powers, but more often relations were regulated by repeated truces, while in the West, enthusiasm for crusading against the Muslim East momentarily declined. The Fourth Crusade, launched against Egypt with the aim of ultimately recovering Jerusalem, was diverted by the Venetians, who supplied the ships, to Constantinople, which in 1204 was sacked, with Latin Christians replacing the rule of the Orthodox Christian emperors until the Byzantines reconquered their city in 1261. As discussed earlier, France and the papacy looked to the enemy within when the Albigensian crusade against the Cathars was launched in 1209. Neither of these crusades improved the position of Outremer. Returning to the object of regaining Jerusalem, in 1217 the papacy launched the Fifth Crusade, though the means of doing so was to attack Egypt. The Templars were involved in this new crusade from the start, with the Templar treasurer at Paris overseeing the donations that were to fund the expedition. Forces under King Andrew of Hungary and Leopold, Duke of Austria, were joined by men under John of Brienne, the King of Jerusalem, which included Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights. The last being a new military order founded along Templar lines by Germans who had been on the Third Crusade. With no single outstanding leader among this mixed force, the Fifth Crusade was placed under the authority of the papal legate Pelagius, a man of no military experience. Nevertheless, early in 1219, the Crusaders captured the port of Damietta in the Nile Delta, thanks largely to the Templars, who not only fought admirably on horseback, but demonstrated a remarkable talent for innovation, adapting their engineering and tactical skills from the arid conditions of Outremer to the watery landscape of the Delta, where they commanded ships and built floating pontoons to win the victory. The loss of Damietta so unnerved the Sultan of Egypt, Saladin's nephew Al-Kamil, that he offered to trade it for Jerusalem. But the Templar Grand Master argued that Jerusalem could not be held without controlling the lands beyond the Jordan, and so the Crusaders rejected the offer and continued their campaign in Egypt. Meanwhile, they were awaiting the arrival at Damietta of another army led by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Despite its failure to appear, the papal legate Pelagius impatiently urged the Crusaders to advance up the Nile towards Cairo. United under the command of an experienced leader, the Fifth Crusade might have been a success. But at Mansoura, Al-Kamil cut off the Crusaders' rear, opened the sluice gates of the irrigation canals, and flooded the army into submission. In 1221, Pelagius agreed to give up Damietta, not in exchange for Jerusalem, but to save the lives of the Crusaders, who immediately evacuated Egypt and returned to Acre. Frederick II did eventually appear in the east, but only 8 years later, by when he was openly at loggerheads with the Church. Crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1212 at Frankfurt, Frederick was also king of both Germany and Sicily. He preferred to rule from Palermo, where he had been raised amid the Norman, Byzantine, Jewish, and Arab influences at the Sicilian court. He learnt German, Italian, French, Latin, Greek, and Arabic, and was a student of mathematics, philosophy, natural history, medicine, and architecture, as well as being a talented poet. These accomplishments contributed to his broadness of outlook, his exceptionally cultivated mind, and his rather idiosyncratic character, which earned him the title of Stupor Mundi, Wonder of the World. But they also engendered suspicion. It was rumored that Frederick did not believe in God, and it was put about that he scoffed at the virgin birth of Jesus and described Mohammed, Jesus, and Moses as the three impostors or deceivers of the world. This might have been the black propaganda of the papacy at Rome, which was worried at being encircled by his domains and was also agitated by Frederick's claim to supreme authority and his boast that he would revive the Roman Empire, to which the papacy countered by saying the Church had a higher authority in God. Frederick had been 21 when he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor and vowed to take the cross, but he failed to appear in Egypt during the Fifth Crusade and time and again put off his departure for the East. But in 1225, when John of Brienne, the aged king of Jerusalem, came west seeking a husband for his 14-year-old daughter Yolanda, whom he had crowned queen at Acre, Frederick saw his opportunity. Marrying her at Brindisi, Frederick broke his promise that John of Brienne could continue as regent. Instead, Frederick claimed the right as Yolanda's husband to become king, a move that would confirm him, he imagined, as the supreme sovereign in the Christian world. Now, in 1228, at the age of 36, Frederick finally set out for the Holy Land. But he fell ill en route and rested in Italy for a while before continuing his journey. Pope Gregory IX, who distrusted Frederick's imperial intentions in Italy, excommunicated him at once, using the excuse that this was yet one more instance of the emperor's failure to fulfill his crusading vow. Then, when Frederick eventually arrived at Acre in September, the Pope again asserted his authority, excommunicating him again, this time for attempting to go crusading without having first obtained papal absolution for his earlier excommunication. Frederick was not impressed, but the barons and clergy in Outremer were, as were the Templars and the Hospitallers who owed their allegiance to the Pope, only the Teutonic Knights braving papal wrath to support their fellow German. However, even before Frederick had left Sicily, he and Al-Kamil had been in secret negotiations over the objects of this Sixth Crusade. Frederick wanted Jerusalem, if only because it would be useful in promoting himself as the supreme power in the West. Al-Kamil was prepared to oblige provided Frederick helped him capture Damascus. But by the time Frederick arrived in Outremer, Al-Kamil had changed his mind. Determined to gain Jerusalem, Frederick now made a feint towards Egypt, in November, leading his army from Acre towards Jaffa. The Templars and Hospitallers followed a day behind, not wanting to seem part of a crusade led by an excommunicant. But when Frederick placed the expedition under the nominal authority of his generals, the orders abandoned their scruples altogether and joined up with the main force. The show of unity did not last long. Frederick's advance was enough to make Al-Kamil fear that he would have to abandon his siege of Damascus, and he quickly agreed a deal with Frederick, a 10-year truce and the surrender of Jerusalem to the Christians. It was a sudden and sensational result and gave Frederick what he wanted, but it outraged the Patriarch and the military orders. The walls of Jerusalem had been torn down during the Fifth Crusade. If it was going to be given to them then, the intention was that it should not be defensible, and that remained the idea now. For part of the agreement was that the city should remain unfortified, and its only connection to the coast should be a narrow corridor of land. Moreover, the orders were forbidden to make any improvements to their great castles of Marcab and Crac des Chevaliers of the Hospitalet and Tortosa and Chastel Blanc of the Templars. And then there was the galling provision, a necessary face-saver for Al-Kamil, that the Temple Mount should remain under Muslim control, and that the Templars were absolutely forbidden to return to their former headquarters at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. On 29th of March, 1229, Frederick was crowned King of Jerusalem at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Patriarch had placed an interdict on the city, forbidding church ceremonies while Frederick was in Jerusalem, and so, with no priests to crown him, and with the Templars and the Hospitallers keeping away, it was left to Frederick to place the crown of Jerusalem on his own head. Calling himself God's vicar on earth, the title usually reserved for the Pope, Frederick swore in the presence of the Teutonic Knights to defend the kingdom, the Church, and his empire. He afterwards toured the city, and going to the Temple Mount, he entered the dome of the rock through a wooden lattice door, put there, he was told, to keep the sparrows out. Venting his feelings about his papal enemies to whom he had restored the holy city, Frederick pronounced, "Now God has sent you pigs." Frederick stayed in Jerusalem for only 2 days. He had achieved what he wanted and was eager to get back to Europe and the serious business of expanding his powers there. But he also feared that the Templars might make an attempt upon his life while he was in the city. Chroniclers as far apart as Sicily, Damascus, and England reported this story, which if nothing else reflected the intensity of ill feeling and suspicion between the emperor and the pope, an enmity in which the Templars had become involved. When Frederick returned to Sicily, he seized the property of the military orders there, released their Muslim slaves without paying compensation, and imprisoned the Templar brothers. Yet again, the Pope excommunicated him, and again, Frederick ignored the Pope. It was a foreboding of what could happen when the Templars stood in the way of the needs and ambitions of a secular prince. The rise of the Mamelukes. In 1239, the 10-year truce had run out, but there was no immediate threat to Outremer. Al-Kamil had died the year before, and Egypt was riven by factions, while the bitterness between the Cairo and Damascus branches of the Ayyubid family had increased. Nevertheless, the Templars remained opposed to the rapprochement between Outremer and Egypt brought about by Frederick II, and with good reason. Templar emissaries sent to Cairo in 1243 were held as virtual prisoners for 6 months, and the Egyptians would still not return Gaza, Hebron, and Nablus in accordance with the truce. The Templars saw this as a delaying tactic by the new Egyptian Sultan al-Salih Ayyub, giving him time to overcome Damascus and other Muslim rulers, and then to overwhelm Outremer. Templar policy was to favor Damascus, and this showed some results. The Christian kingdom gained by negotiation all the land west of the Jordan except Hebron and Nablus, and the Franks were given a free hand to celebrate Christian services in every former church throughout Jerusalem, and to expel the Muslims from the Temple Mount and to reconvert to Christian use the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. When war broke out again between Cairo and Damascus in spring 1244, the Templars persuaded the barons of Outremer to intervene on the side of the Damascene ruler Ismail. The alliance was sealed by the visit to Acre of al-Mansur Ibrahim, a Muslim prince of Homs, who on behalf of Ismail offered the Franks a share of Egypt when al-Salih Ayyub was defeated. The continuing factionalism in Cairo meant that al-Salih could not rely on the regular army, but he had taken steps to counter that by purchasing Mamelukes in large numbers. These military slaves were mostly Kipchak, Turks, from the steppes of southern Russia. Bought, trained, and converted to Islam, they became al-Salih's powerful private army. Also, al-Salih had bought the help of the Khwarezmian Turks, ferocious mercenaries then based in Edessa, who had been displaced from Transoxiana and parts of Iran and Afghanistan by the expansion of the Mongols. In June, the Khwarezmian horsemen, 12,000 strong, swept southwards into Syria, but deterred by the formidable walls of Damascus, they rode on into Galilee, captured Tiberias, and on 11th of July broke through the feeble defenses of Jerusalem and brutally massacred everyone who could not retreat into the citadel. 6 weeks later, the defenders emerged, having been promised safe passage to the coast. The garrison, together with the entire Christian population, 6,000 men, women, and children, left the city, but were cut down by Khwarezmian swords, only 300 making it to Jaffa. For good measure, the Khwarezmians ransacked the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, tore up the bones of the kings of Jerusalem from their tombs, set the place alight, and burnt all the other churches of the city, pillaged its homes and shops, then left the smoking wreckage of Jerusalem to join al-Salih's Mameluke army at Gaza. The Mamelukes, as seen through the eyes of Ibn Khaldun, 14th century North African historian. It was God's benevolence that he rescued the faith by reviving its dying breath and restoring the unity of the Muslims in the Egyptian realms, preserving the order and defending the walls of Islam. He did this by sending to the Muslims, from this Turkish nation and from among its great and numerous tribes, rulers to defend them and utterly loyal helpers, who were brought from the house of war to the house of Islam under the rule of slavery, which hides in itself a divine blessing. By means of slavery, they learn glory and blessing and are exposed to divine providence. Cured by slavery, they enter the Muslim religion with the firm resolve of true believers, and yet with nomadic virtues unsullied by debased nature, unadulterated with the filth of pleasure, undefiled by the ways of civilized living, and with their ardor unbroken by the profusion of luxury. The slave merchants bring them to Egypt in batches like sand grus to the watering places, and government buyers have them displayed for inspection and bid for them. Thus, one intake comes after another, and generation follows generation, and Islam rejoices in the benefit which it gains through them. And the branches of the kingdom flourish with the freshness of youth. The Frankish forces, which had been scattered throughout the castles of Outremer, gathered at Acre. Not since Hattin had such a considerable Christian army been put into the field, its numbers including over 300 knights from the Templars, at least another 300 from the Hospitallers, also some Teutonic knights, and a further 600 secular knights, as well as a proportionate number of sergeants and foot soldiers. To these were added the yet more numerous, if lighter armed forces of their Damascene ally under the command of Al-Mansur Ibrahim, and a contingent of Bedouin cavalry. On 17th of October, 1244, this Christian-Muslim army drew up before the smaller Egyptian army with its elite corps of Mamelukes and the Khwarezmians outside Gaza on a sandy plain at a place called La Fourbi. The Franks and their allies attacked, but the Egyptians stood firm under the command of the Mameluke general Baybars, and while the Franks were pinned in place, the Khwarezmians tore into the flank of Al-Mansur Ibrahim's forces. The Damascene forces turned and fled. The Franks fought on bravely, but after a few hours, their entire army was destroyed. At least 5,000 Franks died in the battle, among them 260 to 300 Templars, while over 800 Christians were captured and sold into slavery in Egypt, including the Templar Grand Master, who was never seen again. The catastrophe was comparable to Hattin, and when Damascus fell to al-Salih the following year, it looked as though time had run out for Outremer. Relief to Outremer came in the form of the Seventh Crusade, led by King Louis IX of France, Saint Louis as he afterwards became, thanks to his incessant warfare against enemies of the true faith, be they Muslims or Cathars. It was during Louis's reign that the Cathars were finally beaten and incinerated at the stake. Now, in the summer of 1249, he landed with his French army at the delta port of Damietta with the familiar idea of overturning the Ayyubid regime in Cairo. Al-Salih Ayyub was suffering from cancer, and when he died in November, his wife, Shagarat al-Dur, hid his corpse and kept morale alive by pretending to transmit the Sultan's orders to his army of Mameluke slave troops led by Baybars. In February 1250, the French advanced through the delta towards Cairo, but owing to the impetuosity of the king's brother, the Count of Artois, suffered heavy losses at Mansoura. He had urged the Crusader knights to charge into the town, where they were trapped within the narrow streets. The Templars alone losing 280 mounted knights, a massive blow so soon after La Forbie. A stalemate followed, and the Crusaders were weakened by scurvy and plague. In April, they retreated but were captured by the Mamelukes, along with King Louis himself, who was released only after a huge ransom was paid, to which the Templars, who as bankers to members of the crusade had a treasure ship offshore, refused to contribute. That same year, Shagarat al-Dur openly declared herself sultan, basing her claim to the succession on having borne al-Salih, a son, though the child had predeceased the father. The Abbasid caliph refused to recognize her, so she married Aibek, one of her Mameluke slave warriors, and ruled through him instead, then murdered him in 1257 when she suspected him of turning his attentions to another woman. Purchased as a slave by al-Salih, then made one of his concubines, Shagarat al-Dur had eventually become his wife and then became the first and last female ruler of Egypt since Cleopatra. Owing to her courage and resourcefulness, she had saved Egypt from the Seventh Crusade, but she proved to be the last of the Ayyubid line. Aibek's supporters killed her and threw her naked body over the wall of the citadel at Cairo to be devoured by the dogs. The Mamelukes then made themselves the masters of Egypt in the person of their first sultan, Qutuz. But it was the shock of the Mongol invasion of the Middle East that established the Mamelukes as the legitimate defenders of Islam against the infidels of East and West. In February 1258, the Mongols, led by Hulagu, a grandson of Genghis Khan, captured Baghdad, put the Abbasid caliph to death, then plundered and destroyed the city. In January 1260, they took Aleppo, and in March, Damascus fell. The Mongols appeared to be unstoppable. The Franks sent urgent letters westwards pleading for help. "A horrible annihilation will swiftly be visited upon the world," went a message carried by a Templar to London. But it was the Mamelukes who responded to the threat. That summer, when Mongol ambassadors arrived in Cairo demanding Egypt's submission, they encountered an adversary more ferocious than themselves. Qutuz had them killed on the spot. And in September, after being allowed free passage through Christian lands, a Mameluke army under Qutuz inflicted a stunning defeat upon the Mongols in the Battle of Ain Jalut, southeast of Nazareth. But among the jealous Mamelukes' victory was no guarantee of success, and a month later, Qutuz was murdered by a group of fellow Mamelukes, among them Baybars, al-Salih's general at La Forbie, who then became sultan. With Syria and Egypt under Baybar's control, Outremer was encircled, and the Franks were confronted by one of the most formidable fighting machines in the world. Medieval Christians believed that God's judgment was revealed through history, and that he often declared his will by determining the outcome of a battle. As St. Bernard had written in his panegyric in praise of the new knighthood, a Templar was a knight of Christ and the instrument of God for the punishment of malefactors and for the defense of the just. A defeat in battle could mean that the Christians were paying the price for some sin. Confession, prayers, and penance would cleanse their souls and lead to ultimate victory. But what were Christians now to make of the repeated defeats in the Holy Land? After Baybars captured Caesarea and Haifa in 1265, a Provençal troubadour called Bonomel, who may have been a Templar, sang that given this, then it is really foolish to fight the Turks, now that Jesus Christ no longer opposes them. Daily, they impose new defeats on us. For God, who used to watch on our behalf, is now asleep, and Baphomet's, Mohammed, puts forth his power to support the Sultan. Another Provençal poet wrote that because God and Our Lady wanted Christian troops to be killed, he would become a Muslim, As defeats continued, it became impossible to attribute Muslim victories to the sins of the generality of Christians. And increasingly, the military orders, and especially the Templars, attracted the suspicion and resentment of a disillusioned Christian world. In a series of devastating campaigns, Baybars captured Caesarea and Haifa in 1265, the Templar castle of Safed in 1266, Jaffa and the Templar castle of Beaufort, both in 1268, and then struck at Antioch in the north, which he captured that same year, treating its inhabitants with a murderous brutality that shocked even Muslim chroniclers. The Templar castle at Bagras in the Amass Mountains was now utterly isolated. Bagras had been their first castle, but now the Templars had no choice but to abandon it. Chastelblanc of the Templars was surrendered in 1271 together with the Hospitallers' great castle of Croc des Chevaliers. Baybars then marched on Montfort between Acre and the Sea of Galilee, and that too was soon handed over to the Muslims by its garrison of Teutonic Knights. With all their great inland fortresses taken, the Franks were pinned to their remaining coastal defenses, crucially Acre and Tripoli, both powerfully fortified cities, and the Templars' stronghold of Tortosa, which had held out against Saladin, and their castle of Athlit, south of Haifa. But meanwhile, the Franks gained some relief when Prince Edward, the future Edward I of England, led a fresh crusade to the east, and in 1272 persuaded Baybars to agree to a 10-year truce. Acre, capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and headquarters of the military orders, was the most powerfully defended city in Outremer. And according to the Templar of Tyre, who knew it well, the temple was the strongest place of the city, largely situated along the seashore, like a castle. At its entrance, it had a high and strong tower, the wall of which was 28 feet thick. On each side of the tower was a smaller tower, and on each of these was a gilded lion passant, as large as an ox. On the other side, near the street of the Pisans, there was another tower, and near this tower on the street of St. Anne was a large and noble palace, which was the master's. There was another ancient tower on the seashore which Saladin had built 100 years before, in which the temple kept its treasure, and it was so close to the sea that the waves washed against it. Within the temple area there were other beautiful and noble houses, which I will not describe here. In 1273, the Templars elected a new Grand Master, William of Beaujeu, a man with considerable experience of fighting in the East and administering the order. One of his first missions was to attend the Church Council of Lyons, which was convened by the Pope in 1274 for the principal purpose of launching a new crusade. At the council, William spoke against a proposal to send 500 knights and 2,000 infantry to the Holy Land as the vanguard of a mass levy like that of the First Crusade, arguing that unruly hordes of enthusiasts would not serve the needs of Outremer. Instead, a permanent garrison was required, which would be reinforced from time to time by small contingents of professional soldiers, and he also argued for an economic blockade of Egypt, the Mamelukes' power base. Such a blockade would not be possible, however, as long as Outremer depended on the ships of the Italian maritime republics, for these were the very same merchant marines who traded so profitably with Egypt. The Venetians, for example, supplied Baybars with the metal and timber that he needed for his arms and siege engines, and the Genoese even provided him with Mameluke slaves. Instead, the Christians needed to gain the naval ascendancy in the eastern Mediterranean. William's advice was accepted, and the council ordered the Templars and the Hospitallers to build their own fleets of warships. William of Beaujeu had arrived at this plan, not least because he recognized the contribution that was already being made by the French monarchy to sustaining the existence of Outremer. William's own uncle had fought with Louis IX in Egypt, and through his paternal grandmother he was related to the Cappas, the French royal family. The kings of France were already paying for a permanent force of knights and crossbowmen at Acre, and the ambitious Charles of Anjou, who was king of Sicily and the younger brother of Louis IX, was helping to extend French power throughout the Mediterranean. But William's plans were overthrown by a popular uprising in 1282 known as the Sicilian Vespers, which sent Charles fleeing from the island to Naples. Pope Martin IV, who was himself French, now declared a crusade against the Sicilian rebels and their supporters, the House of Aragon in Spain. Worse, he ordered funds held at the Paris Temple and intended for Outremer to be diverted to the House of Anjou in support of their war against fellow Christians to regain control over Sicily. Christians throughout Europe, and in particular the Templars, were outraged, and a few years later, after the fall of Tripoli, one Templar told Martin's successor, Pope Nicholas IV, "You could have relieved the Holy Land with the power of kings and the strength of the other faithful of Christ, but you preferred to attack a Christian king and the Christian Sicilians, arming kings against a king to recover the island of Sicily." Another example of the growing trend to put secular interests over religious ideals. Charles of Anjou's ambitions to build a Mediterranean empire and to combine his kingdom of Sicily with the kingdom of Jerusalem had kept Baybar's own ambitions somewhat in check. But in 1277, Baybars had died, and after a brief power struggle, the most capable among the Mamelukes was elevated to the Sultanate, Baybar's brilliant commander, Kalaun. The Sicilian Vespers, followed by Charles' death in 1285, removed any Mameluke hesitation in pursuing the destruction of the Christian states in the east. The fall of the Crusader castles to the Mamelukes needs some explanation. How could such magnificent structures, built at such vast cost and effort, incorporating the latest military design of the age and defended by men of undoubted courage, have so rapidly capitulated or been captured? There is no single answer. Several factors worked in combination. The Templar castle of Beaufort, overlooking the southern end of the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, fell to Baybars in 1268 with the help of first-class military engineers. They assembled something like 26 siege engines, that is, battering rams, and siege towers, as well as catapults, the wooden frames and metal parts bought from Venetian merchants sailing into Egyptian ports. In this case, the Templars were overwhelmed by technology. But 2 years earlier, when the Templar castle of Safed fell to Baybars, it had been down to treason. Safed was the castle in northern Galilee which the Templars had spent a fortune rebuilding less than 30 years before, a worthwhile expense as it guarded against raids of Bedouins and Turks who would formerly cross over the Jordan with impunity. Traders could safely conduct their pack animals and wagons between Acre and Galilee. Farmers could cultivate their fields in security, and pilgrims could freely visit many sites associated with the ministry of Jesus. Muslim sources acknowledged its efficacy by describing Safed as an obstruction in the throat of Syria and a blockage in the chest of Islam. That is, until Baybars brought about its downfall in 1266. He did so not by attack. He tried 3 times that year and failed, but by sowing dissent between the small garrison of Templars and the much larger numbers of Syrian Christian servants and native troops inside. He promised the latter free passage, and so many wanted to defect that the defense of the castle was called into question. The Templars agreed to negotiate, and a safe conduct was arranged for Templar knights and locals alike. But when the gates were opened, Baybars grabbed all the women and children and sold them into slavery and decapitated all the knights and other men. The willingness of the Templars' garrison at Safed to negotiate points to another factor at work: a sense of isolation and feeling overwhelmed, which seems to have played an important part in the fall of the Templar castle of Chastelblanc, Safita, and the Hospitallers Crac des Chevaliers to Baybars within 2 months of one another in 1271. Both castles stood in the Jebel al-Sariya, that mountain range separating the interior from the sea, but both became increasingly isolated amidst the Muslim advance. Perhaps also the Templar master at Tortosa thought it wiser to concentrate his forces on the coast, but whatever the reason, he ordered the evacuation of Chastelblanc. Likewise, Crac des Chevaliers was not taken, but given away. The Hospitaller could no longer raise sufficient manpower to garrison the castle, and for its diminished complement of Hospitaller knights, the waiting became a terrible immurement. After a month's siege, Baybars delivered a forged note purportedly from their master at Tripoli, urging them to surrender. Their defenses and supplies might have allowed them to hold out for years, but it must have seemed to them that Crac was drifting anchorless and rudderless upon an irresistible Muslim tide. Weary, dejected, and demoralized, on 8th April 1271, the Hospitallers accepted Baybar's offer of safe conduct to the sea. Within 20 years, the few Crusader possessions along the coast would also fall, and the 200-year adventure in the Holy Land would end. The truce with the Franks had allowed the Mamelukes to direct their energy towards renewed Mongol threats. But once that had been accomplished, and even before the truce had ended, Sultan Kalaun renewed Mameluke aggression against the Franks. Now, the coastal cities and castles began to go the way of the inland defenses. In 1285, Kalaun took the Hospitaller castle of Margat, perched on a salient of the Jebel al-Saria, overlooking the sea. And in 1287, he easily took the port city of Latakia after its walls were damaged in an earthquake. Yet, in 1286, in the midst of these campaigns, and with extraordinary insouciance, the Franks celebrated the visit of King Henry II of Cyprus, who had come to assume the crown of Jerusalem. The Templar of Tyre recorded the festivities at Acre, when the king held a feast lasting 15 days at the auberge of the Hospital of St. John. And it was the most splendid feast they had seen for 100 years. They enacted the tales of the Round Table and the Queen of Femini, which consisted of knights dressed as women jousting together, then those who should have been dressed as monks dressed up as nuns, and they jousted together. Beyond the walls of Acre, however, the outlook was grim. In 1289, Kalaun overwhelmed Tripoli. The population fell back to the port where some escaped on ships, recorded the historian Abu al-Feda. Of the rest, the men were all put to death, and the women and children taken as slaves, and the Muslims amassed an immense booty. Just off the headland, there was a small island with a church, and when the city was taken, many Franks took refuge there with their families. But the Muslim troops swam across to the island, massacring the men and carrying off the women and children. I myself went out to the island on a boat after the carnage, but I was unable to stay. So strong was the stench of corpses. When the killing and looting were finished, Kalaun razed the city to the ground. Vowing not to leave a single Christian alive in the city, Kalaun set out from Cairo for Acre in November 1290. But he fell ill and died along the way. His son Al-Ashraf Khalil pledged to continue the war against the Franks, and in early spring 1291, his armies from Syria and Egypt converged on Acre, together with over 100 siege engines, including various kinds of catapults. On 5th April, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil himself arrived and the siege began. At most, the Franks were able to muster about 1,000 knights and 14,000 foot soldiers. The population of Acre was 40,000, and every able-bodied man took his place on the ramparts. On 15th April, William of Beaujeu, the Templar Grand Master, led a night attack on a section of the Muslim lines. At first, surprise won them the advantage, but the Christians got caught up in the enemy's tent ropes and were eventually beaten back. Under a hail of arrows and a bombardment of stones by the catapults, Mameluke engineers were able to advance close against the walls and mine the defenses, bringing down tower after tower over the following weeks. On 15th May, after 6 weeks of constant battering, the accursed tower commanding the vital northeast salient of the city's walls was taken by the Mamelukes. William of Beaujeu was fatally wounded trying to force the enemy back. He was placed on a shield and carried to the temple enclave where he was buried before the high altar while the desperate fighting continued outside. By now, townspeople were pressing onto the quays to board whatever ships they could to escape from the doomed city. Merchant captains made fortunes extorting money from the rich desperate to escape, as did also, it is thought, Roger of Flor, captain of a Templar galley called the Falcon, who used his profits to found his later career as a pirate. As the Mamelukes stormed through the streets, they killed everyone in sight, including women and children. Those who hid indoors were taken captive and sold on the slave market of Damascus, where the glut of women and girls reduced their price to a single drachma. By the evening of 18th of May, all Acre was in the hands of the Mamelukes, except for the Templar fortress at the seaward extremity of the city. There they held out, commanded by their marshal, together with civilians who had sought protection within their walls and were kept supplied by sea from Cyprus. On 25th of May, the Templar marshal agreed to surrender, provided those inside were granted safe passage out of Acre. But as the Muslims entered, they began to molest the women and boys, provoking the Templars to fight back. That night, the Templar commander Theobald Gaudin was sent out of the fortress with the order's treasure and sailed up the coast to Chateau de Mer, the Templars' sea castle just off the coast at Sidon. The Templar fortress in Acre fell 3 days later, and at Sultan al-Ashraf, Khalil's command, all those left alive were led outside the walls where their heads were cut off, and the city was smashed to pieces until almost nothing was left standing. 40 years later, a German traveler came upon the spot and found only a few peasants living amidst the desolation of what had once been the splendid capital of Outremer. From Sidon, Theobald Gaudin sailed to Cyprus with the Templar treasure. His intention was to bring back reinforcements, but Gaudin never returned. Instead, a message came from the Templars in Cyprus urging their brethren in Sidon to abandon their castle there, and on the night of 14th of July they put to sea. Cyprus had long been a Frankish kingdom. A century earlier, Richard the Lionheart had seized it from the Byzantines, and after a brief period in Templar hands, Richard sold it on again to Guise of Lusignan, the former king of Jerusalem, whose dynasty would continue to rule Cyprus for nearly 300 years. Meanwhile, the Templars and the Hospitallers had built castles on Cyprus. And now, as the Franks were being driven from the coast of Outremer, the island became a refuge for both military orders. In the Holy Land, after the fall of Acre and Sidon, only Tortosa and Athlit remained in Christian hands. Both were Templar strongholds, but as the Mamelukes gathered for the kill, the knights slipped away to Cyprus from Tortosa on 3rd of August, 1291, and 11 days later from Athlit. This time, wrote the Templar of Tyre, everything was lost so that the Christians no longer held a palm of land in Syria. As the Templars looked back along the receding mainland, the devastation was already beginning. For some months after the fall of Tortosa in 1291, Mameluke troops laid waste to the coastal plain. Orchards were cut down and irrigation systems wrecked, while native Christians fled into the Jebel al-Sariya. The only castles left standing were those far back from the sea, and Margat, high upon its mountain. Anything that might be of value to the Crusaders, should they ever attempt another landing, was destroyed. Even 4 centuries after the Franks were driven from this coast, the devastation wrought by the Mamelukes was still apparent. In 1697, the English traveler Henry Mondrel recording the many ruins of castles and houses, which testify that this country, however it be neglected at present, was once in the hands of a people that knew how to value it and thought it worth the defending.